Good evening and welcome to the July 21st, 2021 meeting of the Arlington County Board. To our public watching from home and to our public here in the room, this is the carryover meeting for this evening, Wednesday. And we have with us each board member Karen Tonis, board member Garvey, Chair DeFranti, Vice Chair Crystal, board member Dorsey. I know we have a fair number of public speakers. We've had a lot of discussion as we work towards this item. Just a few announcements before we proceed with just the one item on our agenda. For those here in the boardroom, we ask that you wear a mask if you are unable to maintain a 6-foot distance from others and have not been vaccinated. The Delta variant, we are up to 15 cases yesterday, and I know that not everyone has been following every piece of the science on whether the Delta variant is transmissible, so we ask that you be safe, and we hope that everyone in the room and listening has been vaccinated. There's overflow room in the atrium. I think we're okay there. Board members and our staff have all been vaccinated, and we are comfortable sitting here on the dais without masks and social distancing. Some members of the public, county staff, and other presenters are participating remotely. Virtual participation is part of our hybrid meeting model, which we will continue to offer for those that prefer that virtual option. For in-person speakers, you're welcome when you come up to the podium here to remove your mask, and when you're called to speak at the podium, Ms. Jacobs, our clerk, will call your name. The podium can be lowered and raised by using the arrow buttons on the right as you face the county board. Please speak clearly into the microphone so that everyone can hear your comments. If you are submitting documents as part of your testimony, please hand them to the clerk with your name and contact information on all documents. For remote speakers, please keep your microphones muted while you're waiting and your cameras off until you are called on to speak. You will need to unmute yourself using *6 if you are on the phone, or by clicking the microphone button on the toolbar if you're using Microsoft Teams or an app or a browser. After speaking, if you are speaking virtually, you may exit the call and continue to participate in the meeting via the live stream online or cable channels 25 and 1085 for Comcast, Verizon Fios channels 39 and 40. We have a fair number of speakers, so we may need to get up and stretch our legs. There are speakers and monitors in the back so that we can continue to see and hear the meeting. With that, Madam Clerk, please call agenda item 59.
Agenda item 59 is an ordinance to amend the Code of Arlington County, Virginia to add a new Chapter 69 establishing a law enforcement civilian review board and independent policing auditor.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. We'll now go to the manager for the staff presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the board. It was 370 days ago when I announced that there would be a board composed of residents that would review and comment on actions of our police department. So what's happened during that time? A group of dedicated residents gave dozens of hours of their personal time and participated in a series of extensive learning sessions about the way civilian review boards, police oversight boards, and the like were formed and handled in dozens of jurisdictions across the United States. This group, a subcommittee of our police practices group, led by Mr. Rodney Turner, thought they'd signed up for a 4-month effort. A year later, they've been still at it. They took time to talk with the police, with experts in this field, with members of oversight boards, and with auditors in other jurisdictions. They've done their best to balance a series of important and at times conflicting values. Every so often, issues before this board are not easily dealt with by slogans or by simple answers. This is one of those issues. So for all of the work of our PPG subgroup, I thank them. And I'm going to go on. I just have a few slides, and I'm going to recap a little bit of where we came from and what the process is. If you take a look here, this is the timeline. I talked about what's been going on over the last 360 days. You can see in July, we appointed a police practices group. You see in October, we talk a little bit about what the subcommittee did. They held 17 stakeholder sessions, had community members, came in and took a lot of testimony. and you can see that their main action continued through the end of the year. Just a reminder to everybody that in December of 2020, the Arlington County Police Department, after action by this board to appropriate funds, went into full operation with body-worn cameras. And this had been something that the police had been asking for a few years and have expressed overwhelming support for. We find ourselves closer in June of 2021. This board had two separate work sessions where we had a lot of community conversations, and there was 3 additional subcommittee meetings by the PPG. The legislation by the General Assembly that authorizes the county board to adopt the ordinance that you're considering tonight went into effect on July 1st. And also on July 1st, something that went into effect that was in the works for at least 3 or 4 years prior to July 1st was the cooperative work among the chiefs in Northern Virginia to establish a critical incident response team that provides for investigative response in serious incidents involving police from officers outside of the jurisdiction. So we can go on to the next slide. Before you tonight, I think one of the main issues I just wanted to highlight on the slide was the question of what happens when a member of the public files a complaint and the independent police auditor and the police department can't agree on the next steps, what should happen. The ordinance in front of you has an option A, an option B, and then we also added in a combined option, option A and B together, which was something that was recommended by our PPG subgroup. Let's go on to the next slide. I wanted to state up front, because I know these two issues are going to be the subject of a lot of conversation and perhaps a lot of testimony, that there are 2 changes that need to be made to the authorizing legislation. I know the authorizing legislation's only been in effect for 3 weeks, but as we've gone through it, I would like to state clearly, I stated this in the board report, that I think the county board should, at its option, have the authority to hire and oversee the independent policing auditor. There's been a lot of commentary that if the independent policing auditor is hired by me, somehow that he or she would not have the requisite independence. I'm not going to debate that issue, but I think that it's absolutely appropriate that to remove any question of appearances about lack of independence, that this board have the option to do that. Also, there's been continued conversation back and forth, getting into a little bit of legislative arcana here, but the Community Oversight Board, as we read the ordinance as drafted, the legislation as drafted by the General Assembly, does not provide the opportunity for a constituted Community Oversight Board to go into and convene in closed session. And that's going to be critical given that they're dealing with personnel and sensitive information. Go on to the next slide. Again, the public engagement, again, bringing that up, we had 13 times there were sessions held. The PPG also solicited online feedback. And I think there's one more slide. You can take a look at this yourself. I think everybody here on the dais participated, as did a number of members of the audience. On June 10th, we had a work session with the Commonwealth Attorney and the Public Defender and members of the PPG. And then county board members held small interactive conversations with the community on June 22nd. I did want to finish up with the last slide here that talks about what happens after tonight, assuming the board adopts an ordinance. There are a number of steps that lie ahead, and I would like to emphasize it's already been 360 days since I committed to doing this, and it seems like the road ahead is still a little bit lengthy, but we have joined as a county the National Association of Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, that organization. They have committed to and will be coming in to do training for county board members. That will be done in public, and that will provide guidance to you and best practices on how to go about finding, selecting, and then working with Community Oversight Board candidates. You'll begin soliciting applications for that. We also will pursue draft legislation in the General Assembly. Late in the fall, at some indefinite point, I can't say exactly when, the members would be chosen by the board under the draft ordinance. 30 days after that, I would be working to make sure that after the bylaws have been adopted and an MOU has been agreed to, that we begin recruitment for the independent policing auditor. And I'll talk a little bit later. I'm committing to working with the members of the Oversight Board on the drafting of that position announcement. And also, there are several parts of the recruitment process. I'm committing tonight to making sure that at least the chair of that Oversight Board has the, I'm not going to call it glory, but has the fun of sitting in on some of the interview panels and offering their thoughts, and that before I would actually announce the hire, that that individual would meet with the Oversight Board for their opportunity to have a conversation. And that at some point, I estimate sometime in the spring, that the Oversight Board would pass a resolution saying it's ready to get to work with staffing fully in place and ready to go. And that concludes my presentation. Back to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Manager. We do, I believe, yes, we have the chair of our Police Practices Group Subcommittee, Mr. Turner. If you would come on up to the front. There won't be a spotlight on you, but we would love it if you'd share your thoughts after, 15 meetings you said, Mr. Manager, this round and a whole bunch before. So, Mr. Turner, when you're ready, if you'd offer your thoughts, that'd be wonderful. Our practice is for commission leaders to sit at these tables, and therefore we won't use the podium. Oop, I think the red light just turned off. You want to test it? Ms. Jacobs, we had a moment, and then we didn't. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I don't want to belabor the point. The county manager, Mr. Swartz, has gone through the process pretty well that we followed, and you've heard me speak about this before. Once again, I do want to commend you and the county manager for being proactive in this effort. Obviously, the events of last summer brought us to this point to make us realize that things had to be addressed. But I do want to commend you without having to wait for an incident in Arlington to go forward with this. I also want to commend my fellow committee members. And I want to, once again, because I couldn't have done this without them, name them. There's Mr. Kent Carter. I don't believe he's here. Captain Latasha Chamberlain, who is here, is a great aid to us. Kim Phillip, I don't believe she's here, but maybe they're on the virtually, and Mr. Saul Reyes. They have been great to work with, and I think the virtual meetings helped us get our work done, because I'm certain if they were in the room with me, we had some challenges. But I'm happy we got through the work. As the county manager said, he convened us in July of last year. We essentially got our work done in about 4 months. We began our work in earnest after Labor Day, September 2020, and we submitted our draft report, which is substantially the report you received ultimately this spring on December 18th. As you know, we had a working session in June where the chair gave us some additional work to work on to help figure out some thorny issues. And I think we came up with a resolution, once again, thanks to my colleagues reconvening, talking about these issues. And I want to give some special credit to Captain Latasha Chamberlain for helping us point out how we can work a collaborative method of doing investigations in a collaborative fashion, as well as in a not sequenced, but at the same time. As I mentioned to you before, our goals to resolve here were increasing transparency and accountability. I think the solution we proposed to you ultimately will do both. For certain, it will help transparency, and we hope at the end result will be more accountability. And with that, I will not belabor the point. Thank you very much for having me here, and I look forward to hearing the others speak.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Turner. So we will let you off the hook if you want to sit back in the audience, but we may call you back up if we have questions. You can also sit at that table if you'd like. With that, Madam Clerk, we are ready for public speakers.
Our first speaker is Jamie Abrams, followed by Matt. We don't have a last name for Matt.
Ms. Abrams remotely, I'm trying to see if she's here.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
We can. Go ahead, Ms. Abrams.
Wonderful. Thank you. So my sense is that we are on pace tonight to pass a hesitant and overly cautious version of this ordinance, and we're going this route, disavowing the full scope of the Virginia authorizing legislation, disavowing the full breadth of the recommendations of the PPG subcommittee, and disavowing the detailed markup submitted by community organizations like the NAACP and Arlington for Justice, all in the name of law enforcement morale. And if there's any truth to that sentiment among the board tonight, I urge you to reconsider that as a very distorted political framing, to view this as choosing between the community that you serve and the law enforcement that you supervise. It really distorts community oversight. We use community oversight every day in our functioning. We use it to decide business disputes, to decide housing disputes. We use it to decide people's basic freedoms in our jury system every day. Civilian oversight is something for you all to frame as leaders. It's not an either or, it's a both and. So meaningful community oversight with binding disciplinary authority, with subpoena power, is good for all constituencies. It's an insurance mechanism, it's a protective guardrail for the community, for law enforcement, and maybe more than anyone, for you all. It protects you and prepares us in advance for a volatile and dicey situation, so we're ready to act with safe and fair mechanisms in place. So community oversight is good leadership. It's conscious of the political and social moment in which you lead. It's not, legislative bargaining is not a way to compel morale, and it's not a way to coerce trust out of the community. Community oversight, well structured, is the tool to build trust between police and law enforcement, from which morale will grow and flourish. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Abrams. In person, is there a Matt in person? Okay,
Hi. It's supposed to be Matt. I'm supposed to be in person, but today Mandela is 6 months, so.
I think it's Mr. Rogers. Go ahead, Matt Rogers.
Hi, yeah, thank you guys. I'll associate myself with many of the comments before me, and I want to thank you guys for taking up this important and difficult, dicey issue. The happenings of the last year largely precipitated our actions today, or your actions today, and but this is a result of many years of bad behavior by people who we as a community have deputized with the ability to take life. And so, and not all these situations will be life-ending situations, hopefully not, hopefully less often. However, I think about these things in two buckets, essentially oversight and accountability. And if you don't have subpoena power or ability to find facts, how can you have oversight? If you don't have the ability to even recommend a disciplinary procedure, how do you have accountability? So thank you all for having me, and enjoy hearing the rest of the comments from others. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. Next speaker.
Our next speaker is Daniel Weir, followed by Genie Apter.
Mr. Weir.
Good evening. For the record, Daniel Weir. I'm speaking in my individual capacity as an Arlington resident. I share the concerns articulated in the Public Defender's July 20 letter, but I think that this proposed ordinance is still a step in the right direction, and I support it with a few caveats. Option A by itself, I think, is a non-starter. I'm relieved to see the combination option, including the CM and subpoena option, and I think that that's the one that's most consistent with the PPG's recommendations as they're described in the July 7 matrix on the project website. The sort of option 8.5 that allows further escalation from the county manager to the court, then seeking a subpoena while preserving the stick of that judicial process. That recommendation is the one that I would ask you to pursue this evening. I'd still like to see the ordinance be more clear that the Oversight Board's authority is oversight authority and not just observational or participatory. The difference being that real oversight authority necessitates the ability to exercise independent authority. In that sense, I think that the distinction between subsequent and concurrent investigations is a bit of a red herring. The subcommittee recommended that investigations be conducted by an independent auditor, and I hope that you find a way to reintroduce language making it clear that the ACPD helps the COB and IPA conduct an investigation rather than the other way around. Usually, in large corporations, it's recommended that auditors, general counsel, CISO, and other functions whose job includes independent oversight not share a reporting structure with the teams that they oversee. They're supposed to report to the board and not to the CEO. So in order to get a true independent community oversight function, staff reporting ultimately needs to be via a different channel, as is the case with the county auditor and the county attorney. And I hope that this is something that can be addressed and accomplished in future reviews. So with that, thank you for your consideration and your time and attention to this matter, and good luck with your proceedings.
Thank you, Mr. Weir. Next speaker.
Next speaker is Genie Apter, followed by Stephanie Thomas.
Ms. Apter, are you there?
Yes, I am there. Can you hear me?
We can. Go ahead.
Great. So my name is Genie Apter. I'm a 10-plus year Arlington resident, a proud parent of an APS student, and an engaged citizen. I am calling, as I have written, simply to urge you to empower your community advisory board to independently and concurrently investigate officers, as your own PPG has advised, and as I know interest in the community reflects. We have seen what occurs when communities are not so empowered in Minneapolis and in St. Louis and in Virginia Beach and Fairfax, where such review-only boards are seen as rubber stamps. I urge you to listen to your own PPG, listen to our friends and neighbors who have written and will speak here tonight, and listen to the brown and black voices and their allies who are imploring you over and over to stand up a true civilian review board that can act independently in the best interests of their community. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Apter.
Our next speaker is Stephanie Thomas, followed by Brendan Meehan.
Ms. Thomas.
Hi, I am virtual, not in person. My name is Stephanie Thomas. I am a member of the Barcroft neighborhood, and I've lived in Arlington for over 20 years. I think Arlington has both the ability and the responsibility to be a leader in this area, and I know there's been some movement in that direction by undertaking this activity. But I think there needs to be more done with regards to the ordinance. The advisory committee recommendations allowed for a meaningful role by the oversight board in the community, and also would be a model for other communities in the country and in the state, which I think is an important function that we need to play. Independent oversight is not a unique idea. It is a best practice for governance in all kinds of entities, including government entities, nonprofits, for-profits, and as someone said earlier, that really involves independence. It involves clearly defined roles and the authority to act, which I think is something that's missing from this draft. I would like to see a stronger ordinance. I think the current draft is outdated, and communities that have used this kind of model without as much authority, without independence, have found that it has not created the kind of cooperation and community engagement and trust building with the police department and the communities involved. And for these reasons, I would ask the board to include the suggestions by the Arlington NAACP as to how to strengthen this ordinance. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Thomas.
Our next speaker is Brendan Meehan, followed by Sarah Munson.
Mr. Meehan.
Good evening. I've been an Arlington resident for over a decade, and Though I've lived elsewhere in the country, I've never claimed any of those places as home. But I consider Arlington to be my home. And I'm very proud to be from Arlington. It's a place that's progressive and it really cares about its residents. But I'm here today to beg and plead. Please, 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 please. Consider the NAACP's suggested changes to the Civilian Review Board. I'm well aware that people come here and ask and stand in front of you and ask for a lot of different things. All of those things are important too. But your support in making these adjustments quite literally gives you the opportunity to save lives. It seems like if I were on the board, I would want to be on the right side of history with this one. I would want to be the one who pushed for more oversight and listened to my community members, especially those people of color in the community who are more likely to have negative and deadly interactions with the police. Please show the Arlington community members of color that you care about them. Please take their suggestions to heart. Be on the right side of history. We'll all be better off for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Meehan.
Our next speaker, Sarah Munson, followed by Jill Dewitt.
Ms. Munson, are you there? Virtually, I think.
You can hear me?
We can. Go ahead, Ms. Munson.
Hello? Oh, I'm sorry. I'd like to speak in support of the Arlington chapter of the NAACP's position regarding the proposed ordinance that concerns a law enforcement community oversight board and independent policing auditor. Speaking for myself, the county board's seeming reluctance to trust a COB with the independence that the NAACP supports corresponds in a fundamental way to the bias toward people of color that is as old as our country. The issue of accountable COBs came to the fore with the killing of George Floyd. I believe our country is at a critical place in its reckoning with racism, and that is reflected in the many current efforts to address inequities in law enforcement, housing, health, education, voting, and more. I urge the board to take all of this into consideration in your deliberations on the independence of a COB. I hope that you will use your full authority from the General Assembly to create a COB with meaningful, independent, investigative, and disciplinary power. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Munson.
Our next speaker is Jill DeWitt, followed by Stacy Cavanaugh.
Ms. DeWitt.
Can you hear me?
We can. Go ahead.
Yes. Last year, in response to a national civil rights movement focused on criminal justice reform, Democrats in the Virginia General Assembly, including all members of the Arlington delegation, took a strong stance in favor of independent oversight of the Virginia Police Department. They passed an excellent bill that enabled progressive communities like ours to restore accountability to local policing, following almost all of the best practices recommended by respected national groups such as NACOL. The county board apparently sees little value in independent oversight of police misconduct. In fact, the board appears to doubt that anything is wrong with our local police department, despite overwhelming evidence that, among other things, they engage in racist traffic enforcement practices, they over-police persons struggling with homelessness, addiction, and mental illness, and as the new decertification procedures have shown us, their officers cannot even be trusted to tell the truth during criminal investigations. What the board is standing behind tonight is little more than performance masquerading as policy. At the insistence of police and almost no one else, the county manager and board are allowing the police departments to maintain control over their own internal investigations. And they are allowing the community to do during those investigations is stand by and watch. This is not what the General Assembly wanted. It is not what our delegation wanted. It is not what the community wants. It is what the police department wants. We know how this is going to turn out. We know that the choices police internal investigators will make during the fact-finding processes to protect their colleagues. We know that the auditor and oversight board will lack the tools that they need to prevent biased, unreliable internal investigations. Arlington could have led the way as champions of human rights. Instead, we are doubling down on the status quo. This proposal is deeply disappointing and simply not good enough.
Thank you, Ms. Dewitt.
Our next speaker is Stacey Kavanaugh, followed by Joshua Farr.
Ms. Kavanaugh.
Hi, good afternoon, good evening. I'm an Arlington resident, a proud parent of a graduated son from HB Woodlawn, and I do call Arlington my home. And I am calling in today in support of the NAACP and Arlington Justice with their letter of concern raised on the rights and responsibilities and the latitude for the community board to make decisions and to have an impact on the outcome of concerns. And I feel at this juncture that it is our responsibility to ensure equity and fairness and be advocates and allies to hold people in power accountable, and that extends to the police force. And to this end, I will cede the rest of my time, but I wanted to represent my concerns, and I look forward to participating further as warranted to ensure that there is equity and justice in the power structure to support all citizens fairly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Kavanaugh.
Our next speaker is Joshua Farr, followed by Michael Henninger.
Mr. Farrar.
Good evening. My name is Joshua Farr. Hi, everyone. I'm a member of Arlington County's Information Technology Advisory Commission, and I echo the concerns of my fellow citizens here tonight. The Constitution of the United States provides mechanisms not only to authorize government activity, but also to protect us as citizens, our human rights from adverse action by the state. A requirement that appears evident to me through a list of untimely deaths from Freddie Gray and Sandra Bland to Philando Castile, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd, who are all victims of state violence. So in order to provide us, the community, with the greatest degree of protection from the state, you all respectively, we require truly independent mechanisms constitutionally protected to protect us, just as the right to vote and other democratic reforms, and protect our freedom and safety from tyranny and autocracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Farr.
Our next speaker is Michael Henninger, followed by Audrey Clement.
Mr. Henninger.
Good evening, members of the County Board. My name is Michael Henninger. I'm here on behalf of the NAACP and also impacted communities who cannot be here with us tonight. Sorry, I'm raise it a little bit.
There you go. You can.
Just to be clear, the NAACP is not anti-police. Just want to make that real clear. But we are pro-justice. We are just asking for everyone to be treated with dignity and respect. Arlington will be a diverse and inclusive world-class urban community with secure, attractive residential and commercial neighborhoods where people unite to form a caring, learning, participating, sustainable community in which each person is important. That's the state or the vision statement for Arlington County, and I'd like to emphasize a community in which each person is important. Tonight, we are present with you to remind you that each person is important, that every voice does matter, including the voices that we cannot hear. When Breonna Taylor was executed in her sleep, surprisingly, the Louisville Civilian Oversight Board was not permitted to conduct their investigation. In Minneapolis, the Civilian Oversight Board could not act on the 18 complaints that Derek Chauvin received before he murdered George Floyd. The ACLU and the Virginia NAACP have come out against the model that Arlington County will enact tonight. When has the NAACP or the ACLU ever been on the wrong side of history? History has our eyes on us tonight, and tonight this board writes history on the opposite side of the NAACP, the ACLU, and impacted community members. When I grow old, my grandkids will ask me about this moment in history and ask, Grandpa, what did you do during this time? And I will tell them how the community had to fight this county board to our death to try to restore trust in impacted communities. When they ask me if this is when I lived in Texas, I'll say, no, kiddos. This was in Arlington County, one of the most progressive communities in the nation. This county board has the opportunity to begin to restore trust in impacted communities, and you all have gone to extraordinary lengths, and I do mean extraordinary lengths, to make sure that that doesn't happen. As a community, we cannot say that we embrace the principles of an untrained peer jury who up until last year had the ability in Virginia to sentence someone to death, but we do not trust the community to independently oversee the police in our own community. Over and over and over and over again tonight, and all throughout this process, we've heard from impacted communities and our allies. To close, I'll say that the process that this board took perpetuates a long history of insularity in county governance. It reveals an alarming power inversion in which the police seem to lead elected officials instead of elected officials leading law enforcement by listening to the community. The trajectory and outcome here is woefully misaligned with this political moment in history. Our battle for justice does not stop tonight. We will remember in November. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Henninger.
Our next speaker is Audrey Clement, followed by Heather Kelly.
Ms. Clement, are you there?
Ms. Clement, are you muted? We are unable to hear you. We will come back to you. We'll have someone work with you, okay?
Go to the next speaker.
Our next speaker is Heather Kelly, followed by Yvonne McIntyre.
Ms. Kelly.
Hi, good evening. My name is Heather Kelly. I am a resident of the Penrose community in Arlington, and I am delighted to have the opportunity to speak with you this evening. I've spoken with a number of you a number of times and appreciate all of the time and energy that the speakers this evening and the members of the board have put into this incredibly important issue. The Virginia General Assembly has recognized and seized an important moment in history and authorized counties to take action to give communities an opportunity to participate meaningfully in the oversight over and input into how our communities are policed. The General Assembly has given you broad authority to create oversight board with robust investigatory and disciplinary authority over serious allegations of police misconduct. There have been a lot of alarms sounded, and those alarms are real and they are genuine. I'm going to take this opportunity to voice my view of this as an exciting opportunity for the board to do something historic and to build trust between the Arlington County Police Department and the community to collaborate to ensure that our police force is accountable to the community and does not view the community as an adversary. We can reimagine together as the board and the community. We can reimagine police oversight and be a model for other communities throughout the Commonwealth, the region, and the country. I want to focus right in to the section that has been the one that we have spoken most directly to. I'm a member of the NAACP and have communicated as a part of that organization with the board. I am a signatory to a number of letters have been addressed to the board, and I ask that my comments in those letters be incorporated into my remarks. But specifically, 69C must be as strong as possible to option A is not an option. Option B is the only option that is acceptable, but it still needs to be beefed up. There needs to be independence. There needs to be meaningful authority to participate in disciplinary decisions, either by making those decisions or by having a responsive police chief to respond directly to recommendations. I urge the board to adopt the ordinance with the amendments that were proposed by the NAACP. Thank you for your time this evening.
Thank you, Ms. Kelly.
Okay. Our next speaker is Yvonne McIntyre, followed by David Smith.
Ms. McIntyre.
evening. I am Yvonne McIntyre. I have been a resident of Arlington County for over 25 years. I am also the cousin of several members of the Atlanta Police Department and the sister-in-law of a captain in the police department of a small town in Iowa. All of the members of my family take their duty to protect and serve very seriously. Consequently, I do not believe that I am inherently biased against members of the Arlington County Police Department, despite the fact that I am a woman of color. However, as my brother-in-law has told me, there are officers who occasionally engage in disruptive activity outside of normal bounds. Like, for example, what happened to Mr. Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota on May 25th, 2020, and what happened to my own brother about 30 years ago in St. Louis, Missouri, when he was arrested for turning right on a red light at an intersection that was posted "No right on red." Note, the sign indicating that vehicles were not permitted to turn right on red was not posted in the intersection itself, but approximately 25 feet before the intersection. Fortunately, my brother was not killed. And when the officer failed to appear in court, the charges against him were dropped and the record of his arrest was expunged. He is currently a few months away from retiring from his position as a senior accountant with a little company based in Houston called Exxon. My brother was not irreparably harmed by the fact that the officer in question was having a bad day. This, however, need not have been the case. I sometimes wonder what might have happened if my husband and I had not been able to follow the squad car to the police station in what was a completely unfamiliar city to us, or if my brother's friend had not had $150 in quarters to post bail. With all due respect to the county manager, I believe that his recommendation, which does not grant investigative authority and subpoena authority to the proposed Civilian Review Board and independent auditor, relies too heavily on the ACPD to investigate itself. It essentially draws attention away from the unpleasant reality of what could easily happen in Arlington should an ACPD officer have a bad day. Consequently, having sat on your listening sessions, I believe that the county board is well aware of the fact that what's been proposed is not enough. Consequently, I do not think you should ignore the work of the Police Practices Group in order to adopt the county manager's proposal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. McIntyre.
Our next speaker is David Smith, followed by Megan Brew.
Mr. Smith.
Thank you for the opportunity to comment. My name is David Smith. I've been a prosecutor. I was a prosecutor in the District of Columbia for 10 years and have been an attorney with the federal government working on criminal policy issues for 17 years. I'm speaking just as an Arlington resident and not on behalf of anybody else. I've worked closely with police. I respect the police and have relied on them in many instances. I do support an independent CRB/auditor with original investigative authority. I'd like to make 3 points. First, perception is reality. One thing I know from my career is that the criminal justice system needs to be both actually fair and perceived as fair. And the underlying problem here is that the lack of any independent influence, lack of any outside independent influence when the Arlington police are asked to assess their own behavior. This is not an indictment of anybody at the Arlington Police, but simply a fact of the current system. People are looking for systemic change. I note that in the 2019 use of force report, there were a total of 80 outside complaints, only one of which was sustained. 36 were dealt with formally and 44 were addressed informally, but only one was sustained. And I'm not saying that there needs to be any specific number of complaints that need to be sustained, but I am saying that that ratio does support a perception of bias in favor of itself when the Arlington County Police is asked to assess its own behavior. To quell that perception, the public needs and deserves an independent CRB with original investigative powers. Second, an independent CRB should have the original authority to decide which non-criminal matters it will investigate and which non-criminal matters it will give to the Arlington OPR to investigate. I see from the county staff report that describing the clarified PPG recommendations, that the PPG agrees that when the CRB takes the lead on an investigation, that OPR could also have a concurrent investigation, and I would have no problem with that, so long as it relates to a non-criminal matter and there is a lead investigator and CRB gets to choose if it wants to be the lead. With regard to concurrent investigations that do not rise to the my comment relates only to those that do not rise to the level of criminal matters. For use of force incidents or other matters for which there may be criminal liability by an Arlington police officer, the CRB needs to defer to the Arlington County Police or the Critical Incident Response Team or the Department of Justice until a decision is made that there is no criminal liability.
You got 30 seconds.
Okay. And then once the decision is made not to bring criminal charges, the matter should automatically be returned to the CRB. I believe civil litigation is different. I don't think the CRB process should be delayed if an Arlington police officer is sued civilly. Third, I believe that the CRB should be authorized, at least initially, to only make non-binding personnel recommendations to the Arlington Police. The Arlington Police should have the ability to accept or deny any CRB disciplinary recommendations. If they were to refuse to accept the CRB recommendations over time, I think public pressure would build up and that they would eventually there would be change.
Thank you, Mr. Smith.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Megan Brew, followed by Tracy Bates.
Ms. Brew.
Hello, members of the Hi, can y'all hear me?
We can. Go ahead.
Can you hear? You can? Okay, great. Hello, and thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you. I am a resident of Boston in Arlington, and I am speaking in support of the letter from the Arlington NAACP and Arlington Justice. I think there's a huge opportunity here to honor the recommendations of the PPG, a commission that was stood up by the county board, by the county manager, to make a recommendation specifically like this, so then to deviate from that feels particularly confusing. And in addition, to align with the community voices that you're hearing tonight. As a resident, I think that independent oversight is crucial to accountability and trust, and is aligned with the legislative authority passed at this state level. I think for me, when I consider the tragedies we've seen over the last, decades, but particularly over the last year with police violence against people of color, I want to live in a community where we hold our police force accountable, and the best way to do that is to ensure that there is separation and that there is an independent review board with subpoena power and opportunity for real oversight. With that said, I will yield my time, but thank you for your consideration.
Thank you, Ms. Brew.
Our next speaker is Tracy Bates, followed by Steve Yonda.
Mr. Bates.
Good evening. First, I want to thank you guys for the opportunity to speak. I'm Officer Tracy Bates. I've been employed with the Arlington County Police Department for 16 years. I currently hold a seat as the Vice President of the APBA. I wanted to take this time to talk to you about the officer wellness as it pertains to the Citizen Oversight Board and Option A. In my 16 years, I've seen the department make huge strides as it pertains to mental and physical health of the police officers and employees. However, these last 2 to 3 years have been some of the most strenuous for the profession and the officers of ACPD. We knew taking this job would be challenging both mentally and physically, and the stress would also be felt by our families. I come before you to tell you that the strain has now peaked, and I feel we may never recover from it. We have lost so many highly educated and qualified officers in the past few years, with more to come. We're losing more officers than we can fill vacancies, and I have spoken with my colleagues, and they feel unappreciated and scared. Scared they might be doing the right thing in the performance of their duties, and that the public may disagree. We have the Office of Professional Responsibility, or OPR, who is willing to work side by side with the IPA and COB. With that being said, OPR investigations can be mentally and physically exhausting and nerve-wracking. So much so that officers may not be able to continue with their workday or may need professional help from EAP. Option A will further exacerbate what can already be an adversarial encounter. I feel adding on any additional pressures to an already thorough but exhausting investigation will lead to more highly qualified officers leaving the department. And with that comes a decline in quality of officers, a decline in services, and a decline in community engagement, which have already been felt within the department's last restructure from the unprecedented departure of officers. Those relationships we built are being stretched. Trust is a major issue for why these relationships are failing. And with any relationship, you have to build trust, or as I like to put it, you have to walk before you run in a relationship. Allow us to continue to show our professionalism and walk with us before you run with option B and go with option A. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Bates.
Our next speaker is Steve Yonda, followed by Gail Perry.
Mr. Yonda.
Mr. Yonda, when you get to the podium, if you could pull the mic to you, just a little bit closer to you. Thank you.
This is when we find out how low this thing will go. About a year and a half ago, I spoke with an assistant Commonwealth attorney about a case in which I was involved. She and I did not agree on several matters, and we each defended our positions passionately. Someone walking by the office where the conversation was taking place believed my tone to be unprofessional, and that person subsequently filed a complaint with the Police Department's Office of Professional Responsibility. Prior to opening a formal investigation into the matter, an OPR investigator spoke with the attorney with whom I had interacted. The attorney said she had no issue with the manner in which she and I had conversed, and she stated that she did not want the complaint to move forward. But in order to fully ensure I was meeting the high standards of professionalism the Arlington County Police Department demands of its officers, OPR opened a formal investigation into my behavior that day anyway. Ladies and gentlemen of the County Board, my name is Steve Yonda, and I am the treasurer of the Arlington Coalition of Police. I'm speaking to you today on behalf of ACOP's 320 sworn members who make up the majority of the Arlington County Police Department. ACOP and its members strongly believe in the importance of accountability and transparency, and as such, we support the county manager's proposed ordinance for the formation of a community oversight board and the hiring of an independent policing auditor. Furthermore, we support option A in the proposed ordinance. Over the past 3 years, OPR investigations have led to a total of 639 suspension hours and to 11 officers no longer being employed by the police department. Of those suspension hours, 340 were tied to OPR investigations that originated from internal complaints. That's 53%. Of the officers who no longer are with the department, 5 of them were as a result of internal complaints. That's 45%. It flies in the face of logic to believe that a department that scrutinizes itself to the degree that the Arlington County Police Department does needs to also be monitored under threat of subpoena power by the community it serves. For several years before such funding was provided, we asked the county for body-worn cameras. We began recording demographic data from our traffic stops before the state law required us to do so. When community groups said they wanted the Community Oversight Board to have investigative powers but could not articulate what exactly they meant by that, the police department stepped forward to broker the foundation of the proposal that is before you tonight. We understand that portions of the community were deeply concerned that up to this point the police department held all of the control when it came to police-related complaints in this county. And we would be foolish to think that the actions of officers, departments, and unions in other areas of the country have not impacted the tone of the discussion on policing that has occurred in this county over the past year. But any suggestion that this police department does not take seriously its commitment to transparency and accountability is not based in fact. And any notion that the department might not continue that commitment moving forward is not supported by every indication we've ever given you. Choosing to arm the Community Oversight Board with subpoena power is a disproportionate response to the issue at hand, if viewed in a lens that captures this specific county and this specific police department. Thank you for your time. Thank you, Mr. Yonda.
Our next speaker is Gail Perry, followed by Victoria Verasing, and then we will go to Audrey Clement.
Ms. Perry.
Good evening, members of the County Board. Thank you for the opportunity to share my comments on the Community Oversight Board, specifically the independent auditor. My name is Gail Perry. I have lived in Arlington for 26 years. I am a retired APS teacher, and my son is a graduate of Wakefield High School. As an African American resident and parent, I have experienced my own racist encounters in the past with Arlington Police Department. I want to comment tonight on the selection of an independent policing auditor. It is my understanding that the county proposal recommends that the independent auditor shall be hired and supervised by the county manager. This statement suggests to me a circuitous and insular process. I think that it should be stated that the county oversees both the police department and the independent auditor. This arrangement could present a conflict for the auditor because he, she, they are a county staff member, not a contractor or even independent at all. I strongly suggest that the COB recruit, review, and interview a pool of candidates, and then forward the name of a selected candidate to the county board for confirmation to hire. I suggest that the membership of the COB include multiracial stakeholders, especially African Americans. The COB may choose to include a representative from the county manager's office to participate in the interview and recommendation process. However, the county manager's representative may not have voting privileges when the COB makes its final selection and forwards its recommendation to the board. In my mind, this process allows independent policing auditor to be truly independent to represent the decisions and recommendations of the community. When the lives and futures of potential victims and potential offenders are on the line, I want input from as many perspectives as possible so that the outcome is fair and equitable for all parties involved. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Ms. Perry.
Our next speaker is Victoria Verasing, and we followed by Audrey Clement.
Ms. Verasing.
Hello and good evening. My name is Victoria Verasing, and thank you for affording me the opportunity to speak tonight. As a native Arlingtonian, I am deeply committed to ensuring that everyone in our community feels safe and feels heard. I truly believe that creating partnership with our communities is integral to building and sustaining trust with our institutions. This is what sets us apart. You see, my parents are immigrants who lived in countries where there was little trust and faith in law enforcement and government institutions. We have an opportunity here tonight to live up to our American democratic values of transparency, accountability, and security, to set a standard of how our communities through an independent oversight board and law enforcement can work together on shared goals of keeping our county safe. Let's make that opportunity count. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Verasing.
Our next speaker is Audrey Clement, followed by Michelle Woolley.
Ms. Clement.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Can you hear
Go
me?
ahead. Go ahead, Ms. Clement.
Okay, good. My name is Audrey Clement. I'm the independent candidate for county board. I want to clarify what the proposed ordinance to create a civilian review board does not do. In a May 18th presentation, the county manager indicated that the ordinance deviates from the recommendations of the police practices group in two respects. It denies the CRB concurrent investigative authority and the right to take disciplinary action independent of the police department. I agree with the former limitation and I disagree with the latter. The rationale for the former is that concurrent authority potentially duplicates authorities provided to the Commonwealth's Attorney, the Virginia Attorney General, and the United States Department of Justice, as well as the newly created Critical Incident Review Team. And I agree with that. Not only does concurrent authority create a bureaucracy to perform the same task, it deviates from the express purpose of the CRB, which is to review actions others may take, not initiate new actions. Concurrent authority also places an accused police officer in two docks at once, that of the police department and that of its review board, which raises the constitutional issue of double jeopardy. Far better for the CRB to weigh in after a disciplinary process is complete. That said, limiting the CRB to making recommendations after the fact renders it toothless. The county argues that providing the CRB with its own authority to discipline ACPD staff will undermine the police chief and his authority. This argument holds no water for the simple reason that unless a review board functions as a rubber stamp, it will inevitably challenge the police chief by second-guessing his or her decisions. Also, absent an enforcement mechanism, a recommendation that reverses an action taken by the police department will never be enforced. Why should it? It's obvious that an appellate court that can't reverse a lower court decision serves no purpose, as no court of original jurisdiction will voluntarily rewrite its own ruling. The court will act against its own life only when compelled to do so by higher authority. In sum, a civilian review board with no disciplinary authority is a waste of the taxpayers' money. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Clement.
Our next speaker is Michelle Woolley, followed by Julia Spain.
Ms. Woolley.
Hi, thank you, Chair. I'm Michelle Woolley. I am a member of the steering committee and a co-founder of Arlington for Justice. First, I would like to thank everyone who has put tremendous time and effort into this ordinance and creating the COB, that so many people have put in, that so many members of our community have put in this incredible amount of time on summer evenings, weekends, and even during their work days. I think really shows the importance to the community and the vote and the people you serve in getting this right. I think where we are today on the COB is much better than where we were 2 months ago when the ordinance first came out, but there's still a lot of work to do. I will also note that I think we would have been in a better position if we had had the additional time that advocates originally asked for 2 months ago. Since the beginning, Arlington for Justice has asked that the county take full advantage of the authority granted by the General Assembly in the CRB enabling legislation. That unfortunately was never an option with what the county proposed in this ordinance. Our particular concern at this juncture is that the COB have maximum independence and subpoena authority. I admit to being flummoxed at the resistance to transparency and accountability for any potential misconduct. This resistance does not build trust in the community, and in fact, further undermines it, as you've heard from other speakers tonight. It's also antithetical to our small d democratic values. In the words of Justice Brandeis, sunlight is the best disinfectant, which might not be true in a medical context, but we know to be true for ensuring democratic institutions and our democracy. In this scenario, the sunlight comes from a strong civilian oversight board that provides meaningful review of police actions. As our chief public defender pointed out in a letter you all received, of 11 officers in Virginia who were decertified since a new state law went into effect in March, 2 were from Arlington and were found to have lied during criminal investigations. In the experience of the public defender's office, these are not isolated incidences. These decertifications alone justify the need for sunlight and on ACPD and full subpoena power and independence. These are not the only reasons we need powerful oversight. You are all also aware of longstanding racial disparities in policing and the over-policing of people who are unhoused and have mental illness, among other issues. And I'd just like to add a note here that I also think when we're considering the needs of the community versus other interests in here, that there's a built-in bias in conflict of interest for officers that are advocating for a weaker civilian oversight board, and particularly for those who have been investigated multiple times under the current bias system that we have in place and been cleared of misconduct under that bias system. The way Arlington for Justice sees it, a strong civilian oversight board is a win-win. Arlington can either root out misconduct and bad practices that breed mistrust, or we can see we have fewer reasons to be concerned than we thought. Either way, trust is built among all members of our community. With that, I hope you will consider and vote to shine maximum sunlight on our police department and adopt the amendments that have been proposed by the NAACP and also supported by Arlington for Justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Woolley.
Our next speaker is Julia Spain, followed by Wilma Jones.
Mr. Spain.
I find it strange that 2 members of the board decide to leave when I come up here. That's okay. Good evening, Chair and members of the board, and I thank you for the opportunity to be before you this evening on behalf of the NAACP and our now 900 members. But let me tell you real quick about some facts, since I hear people throwing out facts here, right? What's factual is that we've had 5 people die in the jailhouse in the hands of law enforcement in the past 5 years. What's factual is that we've had racial profiling going on in our community for a long time, and no one's been held accountable. So those are a couple of facts. But we are here again, the NAACP and our allies. We spent a lot of time together with members on the board and in our community, going through the ordinance. We've all invested countless hours of our precious time talking through this proposal and alternatives with community organizations. We submitted markups, and you have that before you today. And in just the past 2 days, you've had over 120 emails, we know, that were sent to you individually from folks in this community expressing concern over the ordinance language. What are you going to do about that? So the time for talking is over, and it's now that we're at this moment for some truth, Mr. Chair. Actions speak louder than words. The community is watching your leadership at this moment, and they're going to scrutinize it. We have showed up here long before I came on board as the NAACP, but many before me have showed up here time and time again, and we've pleaded, and we've asked you to lead. And at this time, we asked you to follow the powers granted to you by the Virginia legislature and create an oversight board with binding disciplinary authority. Our state leaders, you heard this earlier, they understood this, and for the life of me, I don't understand why we seem not being able to get that. Someone wrote to me, and I'm going to use this tonight. It said, "This feels to me like Sesame Street song. One of these things is not like the other. Our community understands that we need this. They are asking our disciplinary authority and meaningful civilian oversight of the board. But the police practices group that served this committee, studied this issue, drew on their experience, their expertise. They made recommendations for a more robust civilian oversight board." That's what they did. You asked them to serve. They came and served. They made a recommendation. You didn't like it. So what's missing? Why does tonight's ordinance seems to follow the views of my good friend, of one, the county manager, whose job is to advocate, in part, for the police. They're his employees. Someone who by structure and by design holds no accountability to the voters or to the public. Like I said, and this is what someone sent me, one of these things is not like the other. So this cannot be how Arlington County governs from this point on in the future. The views of one person or a select few can't override the lived experiences of our own community, the experience and leadership of our state legislatures, and the best practices of progressive communities nationwide. We're falling behind. To ignore all those forces, all of these voices and cries because of some fear of police morale suggests, like my friend Mike said earlier, an insularity and power inversion of government. We have to begin to listen to the people. That's not happening. So I call on you tonight as one leader. I'm just one in this city of nearly 250,000 people. But we have 900 members now at the NAACP, and we call on you to build a strong ordinance and support option B. The time has come in this country, in this Commonwealth, to stop rearranging furniture and start rebuilding the house with transparency and accountability. And to my good friends in uniform, I'm going to say this. I serve this country and I respect you. The NAACP, like you heard earlier, does not hate our police. We love our police. We want accountability. I know what it's like to sacrifice. But I will tell you another fact. I've been here 12 years. Every one of my children has had run-ins with ACPD. My wife is running with ACPD. What are the odds? That's a fact. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Spain.
Our next speaker is Wilma Jones, followed by Tyler Bennett.
Ms. Jones.
Good evening, County Board. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'm the president of the John M. Langston Citizens Association in the Halls Hill Highview Park neighborhood, fourth generation resident of Arlington. And I am here to say that, well, first of all, you all know what our community thinks. We've sent a letter. I've spoken previously to the board. And I just want to start out by saying we appreciate the police. I have friends who have been members of the Arlington Police Department, but I do want to say that our community supports the changes that the NAACP and Arlington for Justice have sent to you. We encourage the county board to use the full authority given by the General Assembly and supported by the Police Practices Group to provide true accountability for police investigations. And I want to say that one of the previous speakers talked about trust. And trust is a big issue, especially when you're talking about the community and policing. And I've seen things over my spectrum of life in Arlington, from where the police brought dogs out to chase people to police coming to our community events and engaging with our community. So I've seen both ends of the spectrum. But as an Arlington resident and as the mother of two Black sons, I have to say that Arlington police have not been 100% fair to Black and brown people in Arlington. And I want to say that just last month, my son was racially profiled and followed home to our home in the Halls Hill community by an Arlington County police officer. So things are not bad as they are in other places, but things are not great here. And so there is a need to have true accountability for these police investigations. Now, what has been proposed by the county manager is not what the majority of your voters want, as you've heard tonight and as you've seen in your emails and your letters. It's not what the General Assembly intended. I'm asking you to listen to your constituents, especially your Black and brown constituents, your constituents who are underserved. We want to know, will the county protect us, or will you continue the status quo by allowing the county manager and the police chief to control the investigations of their own members? Arlington touts itself as being progressive. And on many things, I think we are. But I think your votes tonight will tell the community, they'll tell the state, the country, they'll tell the world exactly how progressive Arlington really is. Do you stand on the side of the community and the voters who put you in place, or the county manager and the police? Are you going to trust our highly educated and engaged citizens to help work with this community oversight board and the police to get to a new level of community engagement? When you give citizens real power, subpoena authority, and oversight. Now, as the statistics stated by Mr. Smith confirm about police investigations in the past, we need to have more transparency about what is happening. Now, Black and brown people have been disproportionately negatively impacted by the Arlington Police Department. You can see that just in the traffic stops and the marijuana arrests. So you can make a difference. You can instill transparency and accountability in police oversight. I appreciate this opportunity to speak, and I hope and pray that you stand on the side of the community. And as the NAACP has stated, choose option B. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Jones.
Our next speaker is Tyler Bennett, followed by Richard
Ms. Bennett, Mr. Bennett, excuse me.
Thank you. Board members, my name is Tyler Bennett, and I am the president of the Arlington Coalition of Police, IUPA Local 5001. I'm speaking to you today on behalf of the 320 members of the Arlington Coalition of Police who make up the vast majority of sworn law enforcement officers in the Arlington County Police Department. The ACOP membership has committed and continual to commit itself to professionalism, excellence, and accountability on every level as it serves this community. I want to highlight agency accountability not only from our well-respected command staff, but also from our highly educated and well-trained rank-and-file officers. We understand that attaining perfection while serving our community in a public safety capacity is oftentimes unobtainable, but we strive for the highest standard of excellence that our profession allows. That has been the case for many years, and it will continue to be true moving forward. In that vein, we support and look forward to the upcoming collaborative efforts between our officers and what will make up the newly formed Community Oversight Board. We agree with and are in support of the county manager's proposed ordinance. Further, we support option A of the ordinance. The formation of the Community Oversight Board has the opportunity to renew collaborative efforts between the police department and the community. The proposed ordinance and option A support that effort. Option B unnecessarily creates an adversarial tone from the outset, which does not foster a positive relationship between the Arlington County Police Department, the Oversight Board, and the community that it serves. Subpoena power is not the only way to address the trust issues that exist between the police and the community. This police department has demonstrated nothing but full-fledged cooperation with and transparency towards the community throughout this entire process, and ACOP will do its part to ensure that continues. We anticipate that the independent policing auditor's findings will bear out what we already know to be true, that this department thoroughly investigates critical incidents, uses of force, and accusations of officer misconduct, and that when necessary, it holds its officers accountable when they demonstrate an error in judgment. It is our expectation then, and our proactive cooperation with the independent policing auditor, and by extension, the Community Oversight Board, that we will drive. It will be what drives the improvement in trust between the police department and the community. The Arlington County Police Department has given this community no reason to believe it would abandon its long-standing track record for transparency and accountability at this most critical hour. Arming the Community Oversight Board with subpoena power solely because the state allows it would send a clear signal to my membership that you do not take us at our word and that you have little genuine appreciation for the high caliber service that we provide to you and this community in recent memory. One of the key tenets every young officer learns is that just because you can does not mean that you should. This lesson is applicable here as well. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Bennett.
Our final speaker is Richard Conigliaro.
Mr. Conigliaro.
Good evening. I'd like to thank the chairman, the county board, the county manager for the opportunity to speak tonight. I'm Rich Conigliaro. I'm the president of the Arlington Police Beneficiary Association. I am here representing the over 200 plus active members and the more than 250 plus associate members of the APBA. First, I'd like to say that in Arlington, we have a unique circumstance where the police department and the community have an exceptional relationship with one another. This is something very unique, especially in current times. We have highly educated and active community in Arlington that we respect and work hard for as a membership. This community also benefits from having some of the most highly educated and exceptionally trained, dedicated, and caring officers in the country. I've been policing for over a quarter century now, and I'm proud to serve with the brothers and sisters of the Arlington County Police Department. When conversations regarding the Civilian Review Board started, there were a lot of questions from my membership. People, even police officers, are inherently nervous about stepping into the unfamiliar. Officers worried that the county government was lacking faith in them. Understand that law enforcement has had a very tough year and a half. We had the inauguration, we had protests, we had negative media every time we turned around. COVID-19, these are only a few of the challenges that recently faced my membership. Despite these challenges, ACPD continued to come in every day and protect and serve, while others had the safety of remaining at home. Soon after, along came the PPG and talks of the CRB, or the Oversight Board. It's changed numerous times in the 8 months that we've been here. Quickly, my membership educated itself on the oversight boards, and the angst among them diminished. Over time, we understood the oversight board to be another way for my membership and the community to work together collaboratively. Membership saw it as a way for ACPD to show our transparency and our high quality of service that we provide to the community. Last week, we were informed there were changes to the draft in the ordinance. Now the ordinance had an option A and an option B, and now an option C. For the independent auditor to gain access to witnesses and evidence. I would like to express in no uncertain terms the ACPD, or the APBA and our membership support option A. We believe that the county manager in the final decision is appropriate, as he is currently part of our pay, comp, discipline, and grievances. I've had many conversations, as well as my ACOP counterpart, with the county manager on pay and comp. Some of those conversations have been pleasant, others have been heated. He has never once hesitated to give us his opinion when he thinks we are wrong. I do not believe in this circumstance that this will change just because we're creating a new COB. So excuse me. Option B is seen by our officers as the wrong message. It implies to the community at large that ACPD refuses to be transparent and accountable, which inevitably creates unnecessary divide. Furthermore, option B creates an untrusting tone amongst the men and women of my membership. Although I do not believe either option is necessary, the APBA supports option A and the county manager. You've heard a lot tonight about the need for subpoenas and other measures to hold our police department accountable. I believe that to be true in other parts of the country. I truly do. There are other departments in this country that need a more robust COB. All I ask for you is don't listen to the national narrative. Show me that in the 80-plus years of this department, we have held ourselves accountable for mistakes. We pride ourselves in our department, and we pride ourselves in our community. But make no mistake about it, the members of the APBA seek to be respected and trusted, not only by our fellow officers and the command staff, but by the community at large, by the county board, by the county manager, and by the COB and the IPA. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Conigliaro. Madam Clerk, are there any other speakers on this item?
No, there are not.
The conversation is now with the board. We will certainly have questions, perhaps, but the conversation starts with the board. As we start this discussion, I want to just mention a couple of things that I think are shared ideals and values of each of us in this room and each of us on this board, and those are the ideals of civility and equity. I think those ideals are at stake in some of these, in this discussion. I also want our conversation tonight to keep those ideals in mind consistently. So I'll outline a couple of areas for discussion, and I've tried to think of those beforehand and then listen to all the speakers to see if I have them covered. So I guess I might ask if one of you, perhaps Ms. Crystal, but whoever, might help us just make sure I've got all these categories. And we may have additional categories because organization, when there's lots of different ideas, is, I think, important for all of us. So the categories, first, I'm going to want us to discuss the legislation that we would like to seek change, the independent auditor legislation, just to talk about that, talk about why that's necessary. And then I'm also going to want to talk about the closed session issue, give our acting county attorney a chance to offer thoughts, but also just describe the law in as I understand it and as I think we understand it at this point. So those two items first, and to see if there's any other there may be additional legislative ideas, one additional legislative idea I want to discuss. Then the issues as I see them out there are access to records and information, timelines for appointment of the independent auditor, less large but still relevant, anonymous complaint submittal. There's the discussion of findings of fact, and I think it may help us to tease out a little bit what we can understand about, there's a Brady case and some doctrine related to Brady. We may not be able to get into too much detail, but at least get that out there as a relevant factor. I think, in addition, we have some discussion of the scope of investigatory authority, perhaps the membership of the Civilian Oversight Board, and then, of course, options A and B and related. For those, just so that everyone will feel and know that and trust that we are going to go through this in some detail, we will, in the context of that, we will also show some changes. There will be significant changes since the manager's proposal, the staff report. We will have significant changes, and we will show those to you. They're not a mystery to those in this room. And for transparency, we have both had conversations with Arlington for Justice, the NAACP, as well as both police organizations, unions or organizations is perhaps the more appropriate. Before I prattle on, is there anything else that colleagues or the manager, are there any other subjects that folks want to do? I'm hearing that as maybe there are fewer subjects that folks want to do. But let's start. I think on the law, I'll take a shot at it and certainly correct me if folks think broadly. The manager has said that he supports the authority for the independent auditor to be, we need legislation from Richmond. So you may recall there was a community discussion of our financial auditor a few years back. We had to, because we have a county manager form of government, that's a technical name for it, irrespective of views, we have to change the law to allow the county board to oversee the independent auditor. I've talked with Senators Favola and Representative Hope, Representative Sullivan. All three are willing to move this forward, and I am confident, without being certain, that our entire delegation is supportive of that step. Is there anything, we don't have to get into Virginia code sections, is there anything about the law related to that that is worth adding, or are we good?
No, it's just that Chapter 7 has a list of people that the board can hire, and this is not on that list.
Thank you. That helps. I find that when people say it's the law without knowing what chapter and what statute, that is, it's a different level of certainty. So that's very helpful. The second issue is a little trickier. We won't be able to adjudicate or lay out all of this in perfect detail, but we have had conversations regarding whether the enabling statute, which we've all looked at under Virginia law, says that closed session discussions by the Civilian Oversight Board are allowed. We've had back and forth also through Senator Favola's office with an attorney in the FOIA Council. And this afternoon, we kind of helped to work towards what we believe to be the law, which is that it is a fact that we did not advertise this board, and I'll put myself in it, binding disciplinary decisions with respect to police officers. We did not advertise, and that's not where this board at this moment is. So the authority for closed session under the statute, as we understand from FOIA Council, only would apply if there were binding disciplinary decisions. Our acting county attorney said that absent that approach, closed session is currently not legally enabled under the Virginia statute. Have I stated the law right?
Yes.
Okay, lucky, thank you, that's great. So, we are all in agreement. We've talked with Senators Favola, Representative Hope, Representative Sullivan. I would note that, in my opinion, if the legislature switches hands, the House of Delegates switches hands, there's no guarantees. But if the House of Delegates stays as it currently is with its current majority, I think that that we have a good chance, there's nothing certain, that we would be able to address the statute so that closed session is for the Civilian Oversight Board is allowed. I believe also that all colleagues on this dais are also in support of that legislative change. And I see, thankfully, 2 lights, and I would love to cede the floor so that Mr. Carantonis and then Mr. Dorsey can offer thoughts.
Mr. Chair, I just wanted to ask you or Ms. Kaur to just explain for the lay person why it is important and critical that the board can meet, that the Oversight Board can meet in closed session. Why this is a fundamental function that for this board to exercise its.
Sure, I'll offer an opinion, and then Ms. Kaur, feel free. I mean, I think this is related. It is not appropriate to discuss the personnel record. There's an exception that allows you to speak in closed session when you're speaking about individuals whose personnel records may be at stake. Those conversations are only, in my view, appropriate in many instances, perhaps not all, but many instances to occur in closed session. And so that's my reasoning. Does that kind of cover?
If I could just expand, I mean, the Civilian Oversight Board is a public body, and as a public body like the county board, they can only make formal actions in open session, unless they can have discussions in closed sessions, but they can only act in open session. The FOIA open meetings law has a very specific list of what can be discussed in closed session, and general investigative discussions is not on that list. When it comes to personnel records, it's only personnel that that are hired and overseen by the public body. And so when you think about what the scope of the Civilian Oversight Board could discuss, it could be personnel records of police officers that are specifically being investigated, but it could also be very personal information about victims or other complainants, other people who are involved in the investigation, and none of those things would be covered in closed session. So there are serious privacy issues as well. And so when we say that we need legislative change, I think, yes, it's about the personnel exemption, but it's a lot broader than that. It should cover the entire scope of what it is the Civilian Oversight Board has to do.
Thank you, Ms. Kaur. I'm thankful that I'm recovering as an attorney. That is very helpful. I appreciate it. Mr. Dorsey, go ahead.
I just wanted to ensure that we were going to have an opportunity to just talk about the enabling legislation generally before we left this topic, but didn't want to step on your toes if that's what you intended.
There are no toes to be stepped on in this conversation, so I'll just ask, and if we can remember that, to add that to the list. Ms. Crystal, go ahead.
I think Ms. Kaur did really an excellent job of explaining why this is important, and I think we'll have a little bit more conversation about the one area where I think there is common ground, but among all of those who've advocated, which is the opportunity to protect anonymity of complainants, which I think is a really important piece of this, that this necessary legislative change will also address. The only other thing I wanted to surface, Mr. Chair, I think there have been some calls, and certainly as we've engaged with some members of our General Assembly who've, of course, been very active in this issue of why not just take a more liberal attorney's interpretation of the ability for the COB to meet in closed session and take a risk. And I think it's really just important to surface that risk would fall squarely on the shoulders of the members of our Civilian Oversight Board, who could be sued in their personal capacities for violation of that law if it's not clearly changed and defined. So when we say this is important, we think this is really important for the integrity and the risk of the individuals who we very much hope will step up and serve.
Thank you very much, Ms. Crystal, for that. I really appreciate it. I worried I'd missed that, and you stepped in. That's really appreciated. There's one other subject that has been raised with respect to legislative action, and I don't know that I perfectly telegraphed this It is a complicated, legislatively, I would imagine it's complicated. The enabling legislation, as I read it, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ms. Kaur or others, does not allow an oversight board to oversee the sheriff's office. And I know that the sheriff is here. I'm sure that my guess is that me mentioning that would not be the first thing she'd want me to say. But I do think, and I think legislatively whether this could occur is complicated because our sheriffs are state employees where we also seek to support as well, of course. But for my part, I do support that, and we don't have to go in detail. Legislatively, think about the Commonwealth as a whole. Passing that would be a more complex item, and so I'll just mention that. That is the law, the legal pieces that I wanted just to lay out, and I would, I guess I'd propose that we start to work through some of these issues, and
Leave the law?
sure, yeah, go ahead. Mr. Dorsey and then Ms. Garvey.
So I think where you left off is just really important because for a lot of people, the enabling legislation is conflated with the legislature's directive of what it intends to see happen. And I think the exclusion of the sheriff for the reasons that the chair mentioned indicates that they did not intentionally exclude or mean to say that these practices or thoughts or ideas should not be applied to law enforcement under the sheriff's domain. It's just simply that they could not address it with this vehicle. And it's with that lens that I think everyone should take a humble approach to the legislative language. And I'll just point out a couple of key things that I think inform a lot of the discussion that we'll have tonight, but also some of the recommendations that have come from the manager initially, the PPG, and then what we have right now, which is a very careful meshing of those priorities along with edits that we've received from the community. But one, this is enabling legislation from the state. It's not prescriptive. The state does have the authority to have decided what it ought to be in each locality. They chose not to do it, I think for good reason. I don't object to that. You see this operationalized in 2B, where the only thing that this legislation requires is that the civilian oversight body shall reflect the demographic diversity of the locality. That's a must. We have to do that. It intentionally, in the next section, right before it lists the however many 8 potential activities of the COB, uses the word may intentionally. They could have used the word shall if they so intended, but they did not because, and while you'll have reasonable minds disagree on this, I think they believe that the 8 as written broadly as possible should be adapted to fit the needs of each locality. In effect, they actually say as much in the enabling legislation. And another key thing that I think to point in mind, those 8 areas that the legislation enables and all of the functions and activities that it enables, reasonable people, I would hope, would all agree that each of those would require individuals, staff, responsive to the board. Yet it did not enable the board to hire anyone except for the ability to retain counsel. So one key deficiency is that this whole idea of a broad board was given or was not given the essential element to actualize it, and that is the ability to hire staff. So what we've been trying to do is to work around that very real limitation. So I just want to make sure that was framed before we get into heavy discussion about how we propose to get around that tonight, because without staff, unfortunately, you can't really do very much.
Thank you, Mr. Dorsey. Ms. Garvey, did you want to follow? You're okay. Okay. So I'm sort of trying to marry, I don't have the New Jersey accent, but to bring together the issues with the sort of the review, and I guess what I'd say, to get to each of the issues, we may want to be grounded in the language. And I guess what I'd say is, I'd like, Madam Clerk, if you could pull up some of the language, I think it is indicative. If you could just, we could work through the initial pages. There have been some requests, just so you can see this. One of the requests, it was not mentioned in testimony tonight, but one of the requests was a request to call it an oversight board instead of a review board. We've agreed, and you heard, I think both the Police Association mentioned they're ready to move forward and supportive with the key question on A and B. So if we could just scroll down, these are simply changing those words. There was some request in this section that some advocates made regarding timely, fair, objective review of concurrent investigations. Essentially, we have taken the suggestions that we had, and we'll leave it there long enough so you can take a look. The key phrase that I'll just flag that we will come back to is the sufficiency of any resulting disciplinary actions. That's related to findings. We'll come back to that. We'll scroll through down to B. The reports is related to this findings issue, which was flagged. We will come back to it, but otherwise, those are just made. There was a request regarding the procedural memorandum of understanding and the timing of it, a desire for accountability. We put into the code to this draft that the county board will review and approve. We want to, you've heard, I think, from the manager, we want to get this done and moving, not done, but moving, and we'll talk about the revised study. So we'll continue on this is a blue line, red line, whatever you call it, of what was proposed originally and the language that we will be at least acting off of to start. This is another minor issue, 90 days. This is an accountability to make sure this keeps going. That was a request of advocates. It was not something that I hope it's not controversial to the police associations. I think not. We'll keep going. The rest is taking, and we'll keep going. This issue, we will come to the issue of access to records. I'm going to propose eventually that we start with that issue once we've kind of gone through this at some level. The rest of this page, there is questions. I think the manager spoke to the last sentence on the bottom of this page, which is to have the Civilian Oversight Board engage and have a chance to review, and that is direction that I at least will be supporting, and we can talk through it more fully. Let's keep going. These are not oversight board, agency. Let's just keep going. I want to give a sense. There's, a lot of these suggestions are agreed upon, and a lot of them are just changing the name here. So continuing, this issue we can continue through. We can keep going. I want to give people the sense of sort of where we are. Thanks, colleagues, for bearing with me. We'll just continue through. This is all just changing of the oversight and continuing on to the next page. And then this issue did not come up, but it is an item that I think advocates at one point had asked for, and ultimately our acting county attorney, that this may mean additional cost, but eventually there's a possibility of a conflict of interest when the county attorney is involved. And so in discussion with our acting county attorney, this is where we came to, is just to remove this. For our citizenry, this will mean an additional cost, but we felt that it was appropriate step to take to remove this concern of a potential conflict of interest. Did you want to speak at all to that, or you particularly don't want to speak to a potential conflict of interest for your role? Thanks very much. We'll continue on. And the next page, and continuing down, and oversight board training. Want to say we reached an agreement on this being worth it at an earlier stage. Continuing on, and we come to access to county police department records. And lest I drone on too much, I wanted to sort of open the floor to colleagues for discussion of county police department records. There's a role for the independent auditor to Under this concurrent proposal, there's a role for the independent auditor to play with respect to police department records. And so this is the start of some of the sections. Did folks have questions? Go ahead, Ms. Crystal.
I was just going to opine on this piece and talk about anyway what's important to me and what I think is value shared by the board. One of the principles, and I think this tracks back to discussions of the police practices group, whose recommendations, particularly their follow-up recommendations, are codified in this version. I really can't say that enough. The comments that we're somehow ignoring the PPG recommendations when we are in fact deeply in their debt and have based all of the amendments to this ordinance off of them. But I think the spirit here is that the COB and the independent police auditor should have access to all records that ACPD has access to. And I know that there's been, well, and we'll talk a little more about the subpoena power, right, which maybe the board is not unified on, but I wanted just to find the principle because I know there has been some back and forth about the language and how records are enumerated. But the principle and the spirit off which I am operating is this idea that ACPD should not have records that are sheltered or protected or not available to the Community Oversight Board and the independent police auditor as they do their work.
Thank you, Ms. Crystal. Ms. Garvey.
Yeah, if I could clarify with our attorney, because I believe Mr. Turner was concerned about access to juvenile records, and I believe there's some specific law concerning those. If you could remind me.
We excluded juvenile records and the records of confidential informants from, the universe of records that the COB and the independent auditor would have access to. And as it relates to the juvenile records, there are legal restrictions on what the police department can share. They actually have to take proper care to protect those records. And there's an enumerated list of things and people they can share those records with, which include, law enforcement agencies and school personnel and things of that nature, but that list does not contemplate the COB, obviously, since the COB didn't exist at the time. So that's why we struck that.
Thank you. And so that might indicate we could put that on the list of possibly doing some legislation to ask for, but we would need to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Garvey. I guess that principle is one I share. Mr. Dorsey. Okay, so I had wanted to do this, and I guess Mr. Turner, I wanted to. I do think it's important to reflect that the subcommittee, the PPG subcommittee, came up with a different suggestion for how to do this about a month ago or so, and my impression is that the language has sought to codify that. And that is not to say that the members of the PPG and Captain Chamberlain would want me to say this, have signed off that every word is exactly what folks would like. And among those 4 or 5 individuals, there may be some sentences that are hugely concerning. And I've said a lot. I'm going to ask that you come up and either say if that's accurate statement of the PPG, because we all would like to invoke all the work that you've done, but we want to be accurate about where you are. So,
sure. So let me just recap, and if I have to back up a little bit, I apologize. But a month ago, June 10th, we had a working session. After that session, you left us with some homework, and you asked us to deal with some thorny issues. And so in our effort to help deal with the thorny issues, we came up with this solution that we proposed recently, earlier this month, on this collaborative concurrent effort. We had always proposed concurrent investigations, and Mr. Yonda, I just want to make sure it's clear to you, we were never stuck on the issue. This is a solution we thought could work. And we are very grateful to Captain Chamberlain for her efforts in helping us map this out. But as you said, we may not agree on every single word, but this in concept matches what we proposed to you very recently.
Great, thank you. And we may certainly have additional additional questions, but that's very helpful. I just wanted to sort of seek to clarify that. So I think on the records, we probably, unless there are additional questions, we'll go on to other subjects. And I'm certainly open if colleagues want to pick subjects to discuss. I also, I just wanted to, we could also keep scrolling down. I think that kind of addresses it. So we'll go on. So we'll stop there. And I think this seeks to codify. This, I think, is covered elsewhere to be the goal, so we can scroll down. This is the juvenile records point that is in C. We'll continue down. We've added the cert. It's been referred to, and I think that's good for completeness. Oversight board duties, we can just continue down. This provision is, I think there was concerns from advocates. Don't dilly-dally on the auditor, and that's essentially what we sought to codify. There was discussion of the anonymous complaint. We have put that in, and this in B is a piece of it, but I will trust. There's another place, I think, where this is touched on. Oh, it's right there in sub-Romanet 2. We'll keep going down. I don't think that this is controversial. It's a point of agreement. This, let's see, on 13, I'm trying to figure out which issue we're touching on there. This, I think, is the codification that Mr. Turner was discussing. And this, whether the complaint comes to the oversight board or whether it comes to the police department, there's a need for notification, and that's what that bottom of page 13 seeks to do. We'll go on, and we will certainly come back, colleagues, with any questions. This is further codification, and eventually a report required to the oversight board. This is within 60 days. And this sub 2, as we see it below, is language, and we'll leave it there so folks can take a look, that seeks to make sure that the independent policing auditor may participate in all investigations. This is sort of the mechanics of how to do it. I don't believe that this was particularly controversial in any of the comments that have come up, but we certainly can come back to it. I guess on subjects that we can touch base on, at this point, I'd just like to open the floor to topics that board members would like to ask questions on. I know there'll be a number eventually, but we have, I think, membership. We've covered some of them, but open the floor for colleagues at your convenience. So Ms. Crystal and then Mr. Dorsey.
Thanks. I'm not letting Mr. Turner rest, but if we could stay on that page for a minute. I mean, this is, to me, I think worth talking about a little more in terms of this process, because this is what's different from the last time. We all saw this in May. This is our effort to codify, as our chair said, the recommended process by the PPG. And so we've been talking as though everyone has followed along breathlessly, as we have with the excellent flow charts the PPG prepared to talk to us a little bit about the process. But I wonder, Mr. Turner, if you'd be willing to just characterize a little more what this process looks like, and maybe if you could, I mean, you so compellingly, when you briefed board members on this, spoke about it in terms of values. I mean, really the values of trust and transparency, and why this process, in which the IPA sort of becomes almost a proxy, not in the legal terms, but in the layperson's terms, for the COB, why that matters, and how it embodies or reflects those values that I know guided you all as a North Star of trust and transparency.
Sure. So the questions that were posed to us and the thorny issues that were raised at that that June 10th working session were centered around complications that may happen when you have concurrent investigations, multiple records being, multiple people testifying multiple times, creating conflicting records potentially. And we got hung up a little bit also, not the PPG, but the discussion got hung up a little bit on the criminal aspect, what would happen there. So putting that aside, the criminal aspect of this, making it clear to everyone, what the PPG recommended and what this proposal deals with is the disciplinary aspect of what happens to an ACPD officer if they fall into this process. When we had to wrestle with that, we wanted to figure out a way to sort of solve the problems. Captain Chamberlain worked with us, and we were talking about this process theoretically, and then she said, hey, I'm a flow chart person. Let me walk you through this to show you how this can work. And so we brought it back to the full subcommittee, and what we thought was very helpful in it is that it provides an opportunity for an independent agent, the auditor, to get access to information at the same time ACPD does. And how this works is, for example, when an officer is to be interviewed by OPR, the independent auditor can sit and observe that same interview and then also have questions directed to that officer to be answered in real time. So the benefit of this is you're getting one time where information is being gathered. You're having an opportunity for the independent auditor to pose questions. The independent auditor will also have access to the documentary evidence at the same time ACPD does as well, to sort of formulate, what they believe this case is about. What's also, I'm not certain I see it up there, the collaboration goes so far as to allow the auditor to participate in the planning of that investigation. So at the outset, plan the steps, execute the steps, and then walk through the whole investigation, and then come to an independent conclusion if they want to. Now, it's quite possible two people can look at the same evidence, same record, come to different conclusions. For example, they may give more weight to one piece of evidence, someone's testimony, but for the benefit of transparency, you can't be more transparent. If they're seeing the same thing at the same time, that I think is the definition of transparency. The accountability piece comes in the end. We'll see what comes at the end, but we believe that level of transparency promotes, hopefully, accountability. So I'm sorry, did I not answer your question?
That was terrific. Thank you so much. The only other thing that could be helpful is if you could shed any insight that from the conversations you all had about how the IPA would then be engaging the Community Oversight Board during that process. I imagine much of that is simply kind of a workflow conversation for the COB members themselves to shape with the IPA about frequency. It might vary depending on how profile an investigation is, but if you have any insight for us on what those conversations look like among the members of the subcommittee.
Well, as you said, that will be worked out in detail, the procedures that they develop. But we conceptualize that there will be an ongoing flow of information to let the Civilian Oversight know what's going on. Maybe not the same day, but near the same time, to give them just a flow of information and keep them abreast of what's going on. And we anticipated that, especially in a high-profile situation, that would definitely be the case. If I can just say one thing here about independent investigations. When we spoke to experts, they said whenever you have a civilian oversight that does well or does poorly, it tends to be based upon the level of resources they're given. And so the ones that do poorly don't have enough resources to do the job. And so the question becomes, if you want to stand up and truly independent, lack of a better word, bureaucracy that does investigations, that could cost you tens of millions of dollars possibly. I'm not saying it will be that, but it's quite possible. And so we were trying to find a way to leverage the resources that are being used right now for investigations, keep independence going, and that's going to happen throughout the process. So independence is going to happen with that independent set of eyes on the investigation, putting forward steps for the investigation, asking questions. Then they will feed information back to the oversight board. The oversight board ultimately will have a chance to opine on what the IPA has shared with them. And ultimately we envision there will be a public report on these issues.
This was so helpful. Thank you. I see all my colleagues have lights, so I should yield.
And if I could just follow up briefly while we have Mr. Turner here, the way I look at it, and I would love to get your interpretation on it, it is this process allows for there to be the establishment of a common set of facts, leaving aside the COB's independence to reach its own conclusion onto those facts.
Correct.
Which to me is the essence of the independence that is desired here. But also I wanted to ask, and if not Mr. Turner, maybe Chief Penn, this process would allow, we've talked about it in the standpoint of the IPA having an opportunity to work on the plan, to sit in on the interviews, to suggest questions during the interviews, et cetera. But there's also nothing that would prevent there to be a collaborative relationship where, depending on the circumstances, the IPA could request, and unless there was some reason to deny the request, they could actually take the lead in questioning, or at least developing questions if they had those investigative capabilities and qualifications. Is that right?
As it's written, my understanding is the IPA is part of everything that happens. The interview's conducted by our staff with them right there. So it's one thing.
But in terms of, they, for whatever reason, they felt like it would be value added to have them doing the primary questioning, for example. There's nothing that precludes this from happening, correct?
No, it would be a conversation for the investigative team to work out.
Thanks. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Dorsey.
And if you have a comment on that, Mr. Turner, that's fine.
I want to make sure I'm asking, so if that's the question you're asking, then I have nothing to add to that. I thought you were asking a different question, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Dorsey. Ms. Garvey.
Yeah, I'll actually even build on that because it's a question, I think, actually for Mr. Turner and Acting Chief Penn. Listening to this, it seems to me that...
Chief Penn.
Oh, Chief, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry.
She called you acting? Is that what she
Chief
said?
Penn. Yeah. It seems to me that one of the real benefits here of having this very collaborative approach is it actually will strengthen, it's likely to strengthen, I think I'd just like your opinion on this, the investigation. If the police were doing their investigation all on their own without the input from the independent auditor, or if the independent auditor was doing the investigation on their own without input from ACPD, both of them probably see things differently, and if they can come together, probably build together a stronger investigation because you get both sides looking at it. I'm just assuming this collaboration actually builds a stronger investigative process. That's my assumption from listening to this. Just would like your opinion.
Okay, without opining on the current investigations done by ACPD, because I have very little insight into that, the thought would be that you have different perspectives coming together on this, and yes, it would hopefully make sure those perspectives are being considered, and that may help round out the investigation in the earliest stages.
Yeah, it would seem to me. Chief Penn.
So currently, just to give some insight into how it works, there's a limited number of people in internal affairs, but when they're working in an investigation, they come together regularly and frequently, and to make sure that every different viewpoint's being considered, people playing devil's advocate, to make sure it's a complete and thorough, robust conversation. And I think adding another person into it just further expands the completeness of the conversation.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. That's helpful. And I guess I appreciate, Mr. Turner, what you didn't say in that, because I do not know the OPR process. So we could benefit, but myself not knowing what we've heard, comments about the rigorousness of that process. So but still helpful, and it's good to hear the chief. So, Mr. Karantonis.
Just a clarification. So indeed, Ms. Chamberlain, the flow charts were very, very interesting and enlightening. So for me, for example, it was a very important thing when exactly the IPA is notified if, for example, a weapon is discharged, right? So, and I understand it is not in the ordinance, but it will be part of the MOU that will stipulate this simultaneous. So in the flow chart, it says real-time engagement. And then there is something that I want to understand better. So at some point, the flow chart shows that there has to be an agreement on the investigative plan. So the IPA has actually input with whoever leads the investigation, with whoever is designated with the department to lead the investigation. They have to agree on the investigative plan.
Sure. Before an investigation begins, the team gets together, discusses who should be interviewed, what's the appropriate order, what steps should be taking, and, it's a robust conversation, and this would be an additional member being a part of the conversation.
So what happens if the IPA disagrees with the officer in charge?
They have the opportunity, the goal is that they work to find common ground, to make sure that it's something that everybody agrees with. In the conversations when this traditionally happens, the devil's advocate is more about thinking about different possibilities, but the investigative plan is not. I don't recall times where there's significant differences with that, and I think they'll be able to come to an agreement. I suppose if they don't, that conversation could be escalated, but I don't see that being a major hurdle.
So escalated means that the chain of command escalation.
Sure. If
So
the
the
initial
IPA would go to the next, the chain of command.
Mr. Karantonis, you're describing option A versus option B, which is, I think, the main need of the conversation for the board.
Yeah, because I'm after the point on when the subpoena power will be applicable.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I don't know that there's precision. There is, so maybe we can hold that. When would that power occur, and come back to it, if that's okay, Mr. Karantonis?
Absolutely. I just wanted to understand the mechanics at the beginning. So,
if I may, Mr. Chairman, just briefly. So I know that the subpoena power is sort of the proxy for this divergence of perspective argument or discussion, but that isn't the only time there can be divergence of perspective. So I just want to make sure we're clear about this. And just for the record, as you all know, we did not reach consensus on how to deal with that situation. Putting aside the subpoena authority, we did recommend subpoena authority. I'm not backing away from that. I'm just saying, in this circumstance where an investigative step is recommended by the IPA and they want to go in that direction and the ACPD choose not to go that way, some of us wanted to say the IPA can do it, allow ACP to join them, still the collaborative model, but others weren't comfortable with that. So.
Got it. So we're talking, there's the investigative plan, and then there's, I want to ask these 6 additional questions.
It could be a step. I want to interview this additional witness.
Yeah. So that's helpful to think examples. I do want to, there's part of what Mr. Karantonis said that I did just want to sort of ask the manager a little bit about the IPA until, fingers crossed, we get the legislative change so that the independent auditor would report to the county board. It's my impression that you would want the independent auditor to not be officed in the police department. I realize that's a inherently tricky question, and we won't put it in this ordinance, but I did want to give a little bit of sense, because the independent auditor either can be this very independent, and have been concerns raised about how independent. And I don't know if this is a question, I'm sure that Mr. Turner might have thoughts. Why don't we start there and then go to the manager, if that's okay?
What's the question, sir? I'm sorry.
So the question is there any thought, did you do any thinking as a subcommittee about where the independent auditor would be sort of housed, officed, or not at all?
We did not. I did personally express the concern that I did not want the independent auditor to be viewed as a separate, an arm of the ACPD.
I think covers it, Mr. Manager. Did you want to, or do you emphatically not want to opine? Did you have thoughts on this?
Well, I certainly don't want the independent police auditor in my office. We had, and I'm just thinking back 5 years, to find space for the county board auditor was a little bit of an adventure, but that's absolutely something that we can work out. We'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. So so that we have, oh, go ahead, Ms. Crystal.
Well, before we leave this topic of process, which I have found incredibly helpful, I wanted to call out one other value because I'm thinking a lot about what we've heard not only from the PPG, which did its extraordinary work, what we heard in our listening session, what we heard in our expert consulting session that we had with PPG subcommittee members, as well as other legal experts in our community. And I just wanted to call out something that I've heard a lot that I actually think unites everyone across this issue, which is it is trying on one's mental health to participate in an investigation. It is trying for an officer, it is trying for a witness. I think we've heard that compellingly from our officers about what it means to them, and we've heard it compellingly, I heard it compellingly from a woman in my subgroup who had had a career of advocating for survivors of sexual assault and talked about the trauma of having to tell your story over and over again. And I just wanted to say, among the many reasons I think we have to support the process that has been laid out before us, and Mr. Turner's detailed them well, right? Fiscal responsibility. Our chief talked about getting better investigations as a result. And I also think the mental health and the toll that it can take on individuals who are participating in investigation, whether they wear a badge or are a civilian, is something that this community, I hope, values across the spectrum. And it's, I think, yet another reason to support this process.
Thank you, Ms. Crystal. So I'm hoping that we can show some progress so people don't think we'll be here until too late this evening. So I would scroll down, if we can scroll down a little bit further, the struck language we've covered it in our discussion, so we can keep scrolling down. We're gonna scroll through options A and B. People have seen that. Just to get it on the table, there will be discussion of an option A and B, and how that works we will come back to. I propose we go through this because we got a couple other issues, and that is what the above language is part of option A and B. On the bottom of that page above, Ms. Jacobs, there's a request. This, Mr. Turner has spoken to, is informed regularly. We expect regular updates, and I don't think this is controversial. It's a request. I will say that some of this language I think is new to some of our officers, and I don't think this would be too controversial, but we'll continue down to page 17. I think we're going to be able to go through most of the rest of this very quickly. Let's stop there just to see what we've got here. Number 6, that's at the bottom of what you see right now, is juvenile records. That shouldn't be. We've already covered that. And then just up to number 5 slightly, a little further up, sorry, Ms. Jacobs. This discusses a process for review, and this matches some of the language on page 1, if you remember way back, and gives discretion to the oversight board. So let's scroll down. I don't think that's controversial. This sentence reflects what Ms. Crystal described earlier. If and only if legislative changes, I will say transparently that I do not believe it is wise, even with the differences of views. I think it's consistent from all the lawyers we've heard from over the last few days that going into closed session when there's questionable authority puts the oversight board at risk. We don't want to pursue that. So this prepares us should, and this is also related to A and B, this prepares us should there be legislative change. So we'll keep going down. I'm hopeful, colleagues, that we can get the rest of this is all sort of linked to a couple of this is going to discuss findings, which I would propose we come back to. We'll keep scrolling down. So this is a process with respect to disciplinary recommendations. And I do want to pause right here on number 4. We have a process where the oversight board can say we agree with the findings, we disagree, and this provides a new means by which there could be the oversight board. We're asking that the chief of police should just reply in writing, so there's a level of accountability interaction there. I don't know, certainly interrupt me, Chief Penn or Mr. Turner if you have strong, or colleagues if you have strong thoughts about that. I'm hoping to get here to the end and I think we are very close. So we'll keep going down to the next page, and we can, these are all items that were agreed to be pulled out. We can keep going. Oversight Board, these are all changes that really we did away with when Mr. Turner and Captain Chamberlain came up with this other approach, which we think can work well. This has been added. I think it's a request of advocates, an additional authority for the Oversight Board, and that this would apply until we have the process set up that the county board can review. So I think if we keep scrolling down, we got to get to page 24. This is all oversight. We can continue, and
Mr. Chair, if we could just pause on 69-11, if you scroll up a little bit.
Sure.
If you look at the second sentence there, I think that addresses one of the questions you had raised earlier about where the independent auditor would be housed.
Great, thank you. And I think that's a shared agreement. Think we are there. So 69-12, minor changes, and this is additional authority to the independent auditor that came as a byproduct kind of where Mr. Turner led. And so I think this is the end. I don't believe there's much more. There's interpretation. This is all Oversight Board. We may come back to the timing of the study. So I think the big issues that I recall that are out there are, I would like to, there's a sort of fact findings, and the process there is one issue. There's membership, and there may be a couple others. But I want to kind of, we have laid out what's there, and I want to kind of move through, see if we can tick off some of these issues. So I guess I will start not seeing someone there, and I don't know if the PPG discussed this issue of, I think it's probably important just to lay it out. There's a discussion of what findings could be made, and findings is the word used, and we received in the enabling legislation. But is it fair? I guess this is a question kind of to start with Chief Penn. I think that there are concerns that if findings were made with respect to an officer, there's a whole doctrine of the Brady cases. And I'm looking to either our acting county attorney or, but if Brady, as I understand it, there's some doctrine that says if there is a finding made with respect to the credibility of an officer, that would be a serious concern with respect to the continued ability for the officer to, depending on what the issue was. My understanding is the word finding is of concern. Is that fair?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. I mean, if there's a finding that the officer has a truthfulness problem, then that's, we're required to proactively share that information with the Commonwealth's attorney. It affects the officer's ability to continue to testify in court. It can be raised as, an impeachment type conversation. So the finding is important, and there's things that have to be done when that finding happens.
Thank you, Chief Penn. I appreciate it, and I think that's my understanding. That's why officers are quite concerned about the process, because it is livelihoods that are in terms of jobs that are at stake, and the integrity of officers as well. But I don't know if our acting county attorney, can you describe a little bit of background with respect to the Brady case and how this might apply? I'm sorry to ask such a vague question, but I'm trying to at least be transparent with our public.
It's just a requirement that if there's any exonerating evidence that the prosecutor has to turn it over to defense counsel. And Chief Penn can correct me if I'm wrong. I think there was also, when we talk about the Brady issue, an inherent due process concern, because whatever you want to call it, findings, conclusions, recommendations that this oversight board makes regarding an officer, there's no appeal process. That's completely different than when Chief Penn fires an officer. They can have a grievance, they can go through the appeal process, and the decision is either overturned or not, And that officer, if he's exonerated, he still has a career. Whereas if the Civilian Oversight Board makes a finding or a recommendation or a conclusion that he's dishonest, there's nothing he can do about it. It's just kind of there. And as Chief Penn said, he has to disclose that conclusion to the prosecutor, and the prosecutor will most likely not call that officer onto the stand, which means he is now precluded really from doing investigations and other police type work. And so it affects his livelihood. I'm not sure if that captures it.
No, it does, and it's helpful, and I think it's useful without getting into too much detail. The example in Officer Yonda's comments with respect to the conversation that occurred with, you mentioned 2 years ago, with an assistant county attorney, that is could be an example of where there was an argument, discussion, which others felt a certain way about. So you could envision that being, I could envision, I'll speak for myself, in that instance being a potentially a fair due process related concern if someone heard, and the perspective of the assistant county Commonwealth's attorney in that case was that there's no problem. I just wanted to try to make it concrete. Mr. Dorsey and then Mr. Karantonis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Inspired by this, these hearings are part, decision-making and then public education, but I know a couple of speakers did reference the recent state decertification of 2 ACPD officers, and Chief Penn, it was my understanding that the untruthfulness that precipitated their decertifications were the result and only happened because of OPR-initiated investigations.
That's correct. That incident began actually with a coworker sharing concerns, and the supervisors began to look into it, escalated it to the Office of Professional Responsibility, who did a thorough investigation, came to the findings, and at that point, we notified the Department of Criminal Justice Services. So it's generated from within.
Thank you. That's just helpful to elaborate on that baseline conversation that was at least had during public testimony. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Dorsey. Mr. Karantonis.
So we're talking about findings of fact, right? So of something that we know for sure. So the investigation that is conducted in with concurrent participation of the IPA makes findings, factual findings. So at this point, an officer, normally they will be investigating misconduct, right? This would be what the Oversight Board would be mostly interested in. So at what point, so the due process applies throughout the process. Where would be due process damaged or not complete if the Oversight Board would be unable to make additional findings? So why would it be a problem to call findings additional facts that the Oversight Board could consider?
I think we might be confusing two different issues. There's a finding issue and then there's a Brady issue. The findings issue is that we struck the term findings from what the Civilian Oversight Board would be making or concluding, and that's because the enabling legislation talks about findings after an investigation. So it implies that there's going to be an investigation and findings of facts arising from that investigation. When we worked with the PPG, there was this concurrent model that was specifically designed to not have 2 sets of investigations going on and 2 sets of evidence being created. And so that's why we struck findings from the things that the COB would be doing, because they would be relying on the report from the independent police auditor, who's the one who's working with the police and getting all that evidence and making those findings. So I don't know if that's a different issue from the Brady issue. We just kind of conflated those two things.
Okay, fair. So the Brady issue, at what point of the investigation is the Brady issue an issue of fair process?
I mean, for the Brady issue, and Chief Penn, please chime in if you think I'm misstating anything. The issue that was raised was simply that if you have a body that can make sort of conclusions about officer conduct and they don't have any way to appeal it or otherwise exonerate themselves, then Chief Penn has to give that conclusion to the prosecutor, who will most likely not use that officer in future cases, which means the due process aspect is that they can't have a job anymore as a police officer. Am I stating that correctly?
That's correct. If there's a second, if our investigation determines that the officer did nothing wrong and then there's a different finding, the situation where there's a separate finding puts in a bind where if there's a sustained Brady type issue, then it has to be disclosed. I'm not going to be able to use that person as a police officer because if they can't testify in court effectively, that they're unable to do their job, but there's no mechanism for that to be further discussed, appealed.
Yeah, got it. So I think, go ahead. Okay, thank you, Mr. Karantonis. I think I appreciate, the conflation of Brady and findings was right here. So my mistake. I think, Ms. Crystal, go ahead.
I do really want to put a finer point on this because as our attorney has counseled us, these Brady concerns are real, even with the COB makes recommendations. So I think it's really important that we wrestle with that. This is part of the reason for me that amendment about closed session is so critical, because we do not want an officer disqualified because of something that was bandied about in discussion of the COB. We want there to be the guardrails of the COB with the professional guidance of the IPA, making a very clear one recommendation at the end of their discussion. So that to me is the sort of piece on the Brady. I think it's important though to talk about findings. The point about findings to me, and the reason I don't support using the word findings, is because of the standard of finality, right? So it's not the IPA's investigation with OPR, Office of Personal Responsibility. It is the IPA's investigation on behalf of the COB, in conversation with the COB having the opportunity to say to that independent policing auditor, here are the issues we'd like you to raise, here are the people we'd like you to interview. This we'll get briefly in a moment to the subpoena power question. To me, it is unclear how the COB could reach different findings of fact. They may opine differently on it, as our chair well put. People can look at the same set of facts and reach different conclusions. This is why we want a community oversight board. But to say that they can make separate findings when they've just done a concurrent investigation with the IPA as their proxy implies that the COB now has this ability that no court has, that no OPR process has, which is to just keep investigating and starting an investigation anew. And there's no standard of finality for the witnesses participating in that investigation, for the officer participating in that investigation, or who is the subject of the investigation. That, to me, is why findings is a problematic word to use. I'm very interested in the Community Oversight Board's recommendations, the conclusions that they reach, and I'm very interested in having them steer this investigation through the OPR to make sure that if there are stones they believe are unturned, those stones get turned during the concurrent investigation. It's the implication that that investigation would somehow start anew with no check on it that is of concern to me with the word finding.
Thank you. That's helpful. So what you will see, I received a lot of advocacy on findings, and I leaned to some interest, but I ultimately conclude that at this stage, I share Ms. Crystal's view. You will see, therefore, and I'm not trying to let Mr. Turner off the hook, but you will see in the draft that the sufficiency of any resulting disciplinary actions is on page 1, recommended disciplinary actions, and you will see this also later in the draft in the language. I think it's sort of in 1, 2, and 3 that ultimately we do want the oversight of sufficiency and whether this is appropriate. We don't just want a yes, no as the only answer. We want the COB to have that additional ability to offer views. But we, at this stage, have not adopted the word findings in here. And what I would propose to do, colleagues, as an amendment, so that we review this in a timely fashion, I think this may address some of the concerns that some of our speakers raised. I would ask, and I will ask eventually, that the review here, because we're asking for so many legislative changes, the review here be moved from 2023 in the end of the ordinance to June 30th, 2022. And that's just a year instead of 2 years. And it's a way of trying to reflect reality, but also reflect our community's desire for review. And the scope of such review, I don't opine on that, but that's at least my view. I'm mindful that we have spent a ton of time on this. Mr. Dorsey.
Yeah, initial response to that, Mr. Chair, I appreciate the desire to do it as early as possible. Just will note June 22 probably leaves us mere months after having done all the organizational stand-up of this body. So, but I'm happy to work with you on figuring out what's a good date as well. I wanted to go back to this findings thing because you all were very clear about how you viewed it, and I just wanted to make very clear, since a lot of the subtext of this conversation is to whether or not the county board is choosing the strong or the weak option, whatever that may mean to someone. This is not that. The word finding is not stronger or weaker than the word we adopted. It's ambiguous, though, in the context of the ordinance, which couples findings with investigating receive and investigating incidents. There's also that tying together of issue findings. So as to avoid any ambiguity and not to cause any confusion, we chose a different word that still allows the COB to do what it wants to do, and that is reach its own independent conclusion. So,
thank you, Mr. Dorsey. Appreciate that very much. So, absent additional comments on the conversation we just had, I think we're moving towards, we have, I would say, sort of 3 buckets left to discuss, but there could be others. One is the membership question. Another is obviously the A or B or A and B, that whole discussion. There is another bucket that we've tried to be pretty antiseptic. The officer wellness could be discussed. Mr. Smith mentioned the perception of perception is reality, I think is what you said. And for our residents of color, there is a trust that is desired, and fairly so in my judgment, not hard to say. So, you know, those are sort of areas of questions that I could envision board members still having. We could touch on them in concluding remarks, but I don't want to just make this antiseptic about the language in the ordinance, because there were other issues mentioned. So I would propose that we start with the membership issue, and then I just wanted to flag that sort of any other questions that you might have can either be before or after subpoena. So I think on the question of membership, Mr. Karantonis, you may have wanted to speak to that issue.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So let me see, I was proposing an addition to the language of the ordinance. This is 69-3, after B, 69-.
Mr. Chair, do you want a general discussion? Because if you're going to be proposing language to amend this version, you might want to make a motion on this version first.
Sure. I guess what I'd suggest is, so that we can orient ourselves, Ms. Jacobs, could you pull up the membership section of
69-3, page 2 on my printer.
So this is Oversight Board member requirements and term of office. And the current language is in A, and maybe you would, I think this helps answer your questions, Ms. Kaur, is maybe, Mr. Karantonis, you could speak to it a little bit, and then I believe that you have a motion, and if you could then offer it, we would see if there's a second, and then.
Point of order, Mr. Chair, we don't have a main item on the floor yet.
Sure. So let's see. I think the way that I would propose to do it, while we have the subpoena A and B issue, one way we could do it parliamentarily is go ahead and move the motion, the ordinance that has been, that we have just reviewed in totality, that Ms. Jacobs has reviewed. I would propose to, for discussion purposes, to offer the option that is A and B. And unless there are concerns with going to that motion, we will have the full discussion on A or B and A and B. But I would propose the ordinance as written and showed by as amended and shown by our clerk. And the question, I guess, then would be, is there a second for that motion with A and B?
Second.
So it's been moved and seconded. I won't speak extensively to the motion because we got a long, long way to go. And now we have something on the, I appreciate it, Mr. Dorsey, for the parliamentary correction, and Ms. Kaur. So now we would go to Mr. Karantonis for discussion of the membership issue, and I believe a proposed amendment to the main motion.
So the proposed amendment is to add a paragraph, basically. So 69-3, Oversight Board requirements and terms of office, begins with A, that the Oversight Board shall have 7 members. The voting members should demonstrate fairness, etc., integrity. And I was proposing to the following addition as C. At least 3 voting members should come from historically, racially, or socially marginalized communities that have commonly experienced disparate policing in Arlington or the Commonwealth of Virginia. So this is an insert. It doesn't replace anything. It just says that it persuades and compels the county board that makes these nominations to choose at least 3 of the 7 voting members from specific historically, racially, and socially marginalized communities. So this is a representation issue. I think that a lot of the legitimacy...
You made the motion. Let's see if there's a second, and then I'll let you, of course, if so, then I'll let you speak to that motion.
Sorry, can I just clarify, Mr. Karantonis' motion? Do you mean to make this motion to replace the current section C and to renumber it?
To renumber, to insert before the current section C and to renumber it.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kaur, for that. So we now have, that's the motion. Is there a second? And I will second it for purposes of discussion.
So my argument here, for not to belabor it very, very long, I think that it's absolutely great to expect from our members, from future members of this board, to demonstrate fairness, integrity, and objectivity. And I appreciate that the language as it is today asks the board to, the county board in its nominations, to reflect the demographic diversity of the county. However, I think that it is more than important to specify a little bit more and compel the county board to choose a minimum number of members, 3 in my opinion, from marginalized communities, communities that have experienced policing. We have been talking about systemic racism a lot. One of the reasons why we're having these conversations all together are the systemic deficits that we have had over hundreds of years. So I do believe that this is an appropriate addition, and I am absolutely certain that this board, at the very least, would, under all circumstances, make these choices, but I don't know if a future board would do the same. So I want to compel the county board to consider that in the choice of future nominees.
Thank you, Mr. Karantonis. Open the floor for discussion on this item. I will start with Ms. Crystal and then Mr. Dorsey.
Thank you. I'm happy to begin by saying this is very much my commitment in the selection of oversight board members. I anticipate that is unanimously the case among my colleagues. There is no question about whether this is our intent. With regard to codifying this will become the law of Arlington County. And so, Mr. Carantonis, with apologies, you've given us, I think, probably less than an hour before the meeting to understand this. And so there are terms in here, for example, like come from or socially marginalized that I'm not sure are defined anywhere else within our local county code. I suppose this may be a question for our attorney. How would this be enforced in the future, particularly with language that is relatively vague?
Yes, it is vague. As far as enforcement, you'd have to wait until you were challenged, basically.
Okay. I think I would like to leave open the possibility for future board members to be able to, in conversation with leaders of our civil rights community, find the right individuals for the job. And so, if you have someone, for example, who is black or brown, but comes from a neighborhood that is overwhelmingly historically white, do they meet the bill? Vice versa, for example. I have some concerns about codifying this into law when I think the language hasn't really been tested at all. And I think binds the hands of future boards and future communities from being able to meaningfully have a conversation about what representation means in that context.
Thank you, Ms. Crystal. Mr. Dorsey.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Similar concerns, aside from, I know where this comes from. The city of Alexandria did this with their own ordinance, and some of the issues that it presents there, in addition to the vagueness, is, one, typically these kinds of things are best explicated when you get into setting the charge, the charter, or whatever for the body, which is a process that we have yet to come. And I'll just be very frank, this is highfalutin language. You might as well just say what you mean. No more than 4 members of this board should be white, non-Hispanic people. That would be plain language, and to me, more to the point. Talking about it this way is just creating more ambiguity and not the necessary certainty. And I'll just also come at it from another end. I personally never even though I think this is incredibly well-intentioned, and quite frankly, I don't disagree in the substance at all, but I want to make very clear, 7 members of this board could reflect what I see here, and I think that would be great. And I don't want to send a signal that somehow, 1 less than a majority is what we're stating as our minimum. If all 7 happen to reflect black, brown, other persons of color, and other people who are a part of historically marginalized communities, however you define that, I don't see that as a problem at all. Nor do I think that we should send a signal to our community that there ought to be some sort of a numerical, balanced way of thinking about it. So I love your heart, love your intent, but I think however we do it, we can be a little bit more pinpoint in the charge and the charter, and not necessarily in this piece.
Thank you, Mr. Dorsey. Ms. Garvey.
Yeah, and I agree with everything that's been said. I would like to ask the manager who mentioned in his presentation training with NACOL that this board is going to have. Is that training going to include sort of the charter and the makeup of the board members and how to pick the COB?
I actually do not know. Ms. Porphyry, who's the expert on that, has sequestered herself, so we'll just have to get back to you on that.
Thank you. I asked the question because I think the answer is yes, it may not be, but we do have some training coming up. I think there's some other appropriate ways to approach it, and I agree. I think it's well-intentioned. I think it's the intention of everybody here, but it doesn't feel like it belongs in this. So,
thank you, Ms. Garvey. I've been struggling with this. I think Mr. Dorsey has very good points, as all of you. I guess there's no doubt historically, nationally, that our Asian American community and individuals have been marginalized, and so I would guess that would apply. I also, feel that. So this is a challenge for me to consider. It's certainly my intent. The language says at least. The language of the state statute says reflective of the community's, if, the demographic, it's in A, that last phrase, reflects the demographic diversity of the county. It's a difficult, very difficult one for me. And I must say that candidly, I want to be much higher than 3, but I ultimately, and I will be criticized by everyone for this, I land at least 2. And yet I feel that there is some ambiguity here. So I will not support the motion as drafted if it were to, because I think it is critical that future boards have this. If we all agree on it, I guess ultimately I think our advocates have indicated a support for it. So there might be significant wordsmithing. It might be unclear, and there are costs, but I come down at supporting 2 and not 3. So that gives context to you as the maker of the motion. We can have a vote on 3 if you want, or we can, if 2 is a friendly amendment, we can have a vote on that other one. I think that the votes may be clear. I don't know that I'm in the majority on this, but I certainly wanted to be accountable.
I can settle for 2 if this helps. But I have to say, demographic diversity, reflecting demographic diversity is as vague and not, reflecting demographic diversity is equally vague. Because here I'm really, I mean, when we say demographic diversity in a place like ours that is gentrified, that is whiter as we go, and, successive censi show that, the demographic diversity we're losing. We're losing that because we cannot defend our minorities successfully.
Sure.
And among these things is also that we cannot defend them when they're policed. So,
If I may, Mr. Karantonis, and I don't disagree with the sentiment here at all, I would just note that this is saying that the language here, which is lifted directly from the state statute, suggests that the county board shall endeavor to create. That's very different than codifying what I think is a quota here, and that's why vague language in a quota to me is considerably more problematic than what the state's included. I don't disagree. I mean, I have told the NAACP, and I believe we should be held accountable for creating an inaugural COB and going forward that is actually unrepresentative of the county because it should overrepresent individuals of color. And that is absolutely my commitment as well. Again, the question is what becomes codified in the code of Arlington County.
Yeah, so, I mean, I don't think that's a vestigial hand. I think that's a live one, Mr. Dorsey. So I just...
It's a live one, yeah.
So just before you go ahead, I just want to say, you asked about vagueness. I think the state standard, I asked the acting county attorney earlier, the state standard is the broad standard, but this is permissible, at least until litigated, to get more specific. I was just pointing out, you asked a vagueness concern. I'm not trying to substitute. I am saying that I continue to have some questions on C's language, but ultimately can live with 2. Mr. Dorsey.
So this question somewhat for the county attorney here. My understanding of the enabling language which we have incorporated into this, so shall reflect the demographic diversity, puts the onus in the county to be able to defend our selections in the event that someone brings issue with that element of the code, correct?
That's right.
Right. So, I mean, that's really back to what Ms. Crystal said at the very start. My real concern, primary concern with the new language is having it caught up in whether or not our choices have actually reflected what C calls for. To me, that's just not necessary when we can probably, on a more frequent basis, be very specific about what it is we may want when it comes to a representative body. But we just all should remember, we have no choice. It has to reflect, or at least from the standpoint of we have to defend, that it represents the demographic diversity of our county. That does not mean that it's proportional to the diversity in our county. It doesn't mean that at all. It just means that it has to reflect it to the standpoint that we're ready to defend it. And again, for me, Defending demographic diversity goes beyond proportionality or numbers. If 7 out of 7 are people of color, or women, immigrants, great, great. And we should not in any way send a signal to our community that somehow there should be a certain number of black and brown people and a certain number of white people to this board. It should really be about what people can do in terms of, in my opinion, the other elements of what we want this oversight board to do. So again, understanding your intent, I think I support it philosophically, but not in actuality.
Thank you, Mr. Dorsey. So the question, I guess, is back to Mr. Carantonis. If you are calling for a vote, and certainly that will work. I think you've, for my part, if we eventually vote, we should change the vote to reflect what at least if it's a friendly amendment, what I would be supportive of. But I also do think there's a powerful point made by both Ms. Crystal, frankly, Ms. Crystal, Ms. Garvey, and Mr. Dorsey regarding our sentiment, which is all to say, I'd be stunned if we're even at 3. And I think this is a case where we don't want to be, there is an argument to say people shouldn't be coming away with, our direction is clear on this. And so over to you, Mr. Carantonis.
Mr. Chair, we can move on. I mean, there's not clear support for this, so we can definitely move on.
Thank you, Mr. Carantonis, for raising this, and this is proof that we have not orchestrated all things in life on this. So, in the interest of trying to orderly and strong process, I believe we have 2 topics left, and that is the question of subpoena power and A and B, and then miscellaneous, everything else out there. And I will take any red light interest to speak. But I also can start, if it is colleagues' will, on subpoena power. I am more interested, frankly, we will have concluding comments which may touch on the other topics of officer wellness and engagement with our community, particularly those who historically have been adversely affected by, it's just evident by policing in Arlington's past. And continuing, we still have some issues that I think all would recognize. So I guess we'll go to the subpoena question and A and B, or A and B. I'll lay out my perspective, and then we can have discussion. Yes, Mr. Dorsey.
Suggestion that since I think the option that you've moved to the floor is the one that is least likely to be known to the wider variety of people listening, can you just explain it and show it?
Sure. Thank you so much. You'd think you'd been chair before. So thank you very much. Ms. Jacobs, if you could show option A and B. I don't know what page that's on, and we'll give you a moment. And for transparency, I did engage and ask some questions of Mr. Turner. I'm not representing the subcommittee as a whole to help me work on this. But I'll start out by saying, ultimately, for me, I support the subpoena power, and I'm mindful that our officers have deep concerns, and I respect those concerns, and I want to provide all process to option A is essentially the process would be to go to the county manager. Option B would be the process would go, and I want to just describe it. It would be to the clerk of the court, Paul Ferguson, who would then not have discretion, and essentially, if it was in a proper form and the request for a subpoena, he would grant it, but there are, in our code, I believe it's 5 days, advance notice. So the process then would be if the county manager or the county board disagreed with the request for a subpoena, the discretion would then be to, the process would then be to offer a motion to quash that subpoena. If a motion to quash, as I understand it, and jump in if I'm incorrect, Mr. Turner is a lawyer, our acting county attorney, if there were a motion to quash, that motion would have to be heard and a hearing would be set on that motion to quash? Have I described it correctly?
Yes, it doesn't, the motion doesn't automatically go into effect. It has to be heard and granted.
So merely that the Civilian Oversight Board says, we want to subpoena someone, does not mean that it happens because you have the motion to quash process. The second, and I'll fess up that I was the person who suggested this, is I did suggest the 2/3 requirement. I think that it's a fairly heavy tool to go to a subpoena. I do want that tool, but to borrow a phrase that I think Ms. Crystal has used, I want it to be rare, but still show that critical oversight. And so that is what I've just described is option B, is that motion process. What we are adding to do option A and B, I'll be transparent, that comes out of a conversation that I had with several officers, and I wanted to make sure there's full process. So that's what led me to ask Mr. Turner to help. And option A and B says first, and why don't you describe it in more detail? My impression, based on what we discussed and also the language as I read it, is first go to the county manager. There's a process there. Within 4 days, the manager has to make a decision. After that decision, the COB can then go for a subpoena. So does that describe it, Mr. Turner?
Yeah, let me back up a little bit. Thank you, sir. Let me back up a little bit. So in our original recommendation, this is the process we recommended. And the reason for that is because the experts we spoke to said subpoena power is a nice and shiny thing to have. It's inefficient and can take time. If you can find a way to get the information cooperatively, do that. And they said, especially if you have a county manager from a government, hey, if you can go up that chain and maybe get that sort of support there to get your police department to produce information you're seeking, try that route. And so we did. However, we wanted to keep the subpoena option there. And so we said, hey, let's do all we can to get the information without having to go to court. The presumption is if they object at the lower level, they're going to file a motion to quash. They're not going to say, oh, we give up. You filed for subpoena. And so that takes time. You have to have a hearing. Judge has to rule. You could be weeks down the road. And if you can get it cooperatively, that's the goal. So as to the language here, yes, the chair and I spoke recently, and he said, hey, can you craft this so it works? It was not a problem. The county attorney had done a wonderful job, so I just took some language out. So it's not duplicative, so it's most of her work. And added a couple things in here, such as the timeline, because that was an issue. The county manager, the chair had mentioned that he didn't want this to sit on someone's desk for too long. And so the days can be played with, but the concept is consistent with what we recommended originally.
Thank you, Mr. Turner. I think now we're ready to go to board member comments. I want to say one other thing. I believe in separate conversations, it is near unanimous that I'll speak for myself. The board, I think that this is a circumstance that will be very rare. We want the oversight function, but I think it will be rare that we will get to this point. But if there is an instance and there's a need for that sunlight, transparency, and accountability, then I believe there should be this ability. Out of this conversation, I'm confident that folks will either say, we're with you, we're against you, you're a good person, a bad person, based on whether you end on A or B. But this is, in my view, oftentimes a ideological and theoretical problem, but ultimately I come down, I understand that it is critical to our officers and our communities, the NAACP, Arlington for Justice. I just lean ultimately on making sure we have this lever as a way to assist with perception reality as we engage with Arlington's communities of color, and who are disproportionately, there's evidence disproportionately in our traffic stops and disproportionately in our jail. And ultimately, that leads me to this proposal that there should be subpoena power, but there should be every protection to get there. So I've laid it out, and colleagues certainly feel free to offer thoughts. I don't see red lights, but eventually I think you each got to talk about this issue too. Oh, sorry, Takis, go ahead. Mr. Karantonis.
Just a small procedural understanding for me. So the in the case that in a scenario where the oversight board wants to subpoena documents, they have to give advance notice that we intend to do that, right? So to the chief or to the investigating officer, the counterpart. What happens then? Who is there an answer to this notice?
I don't know.
Would the department be compelled to respond and say, well, you know something, we don't intend? Or who would be asked? Who would be charged with giving an answer? I mean, if I was the officer, I would ask my superior and let them know and get them to respond to that.
I'll defer to the county attorney first.
Well, the ordinance says after making a good faith effort to participate with the county police department on a concurrent investigation. So if there's a disagreement at some point over what records the IPA can get, I don't think you need to prescribe in this ordinance who exactly that conversation is with. That could probably be done through the MOU. But at that point, if there's a disagreement, then it gets escalated to the county manager, who will then talk to the chief of police and direct him to produce the records or not, and the county manager will make a decision and issue it to the IPA no later than 4 business days following the request from the IPA or the COB. And if the county manager says no to the IPA's request, then the oversight board can, with a 2/3 vote, direct the IPA to go to the circuit court to apply for a subpoena. And the way a subpoena works is that you, it's actually laid out further here, but the IPA would give the police advance notice of their intention to go seek a subpoena. So there's a little bit extra time there to work that out. But if there's no resolution, then they go to the circuit court, ask that a subpoena be issued. The subpoena has to be served. And if it's for records, there's 14 days advance notice that's required. And then that's when the police would have to respond. I'm not sure if that adequately answers your question.
Yeah, so I understand it's just A and B, or the combined, just adds another
right
manager loop. Quick question. 2/3 vote of the oversight board, so not of the quorum of the oversight board.
Yes, I believe that was Mr. Turner's recommendation.
And the quorum of 2/3 of 7 is 5.
Yes.
Correct. And the 2/3 of a quorum of 5 would be 3 or 4?
4. So let me just, on this point, so this is a discussion point between me and the chair. The original recommendation is consistent throughout this ordinance was 2/3 of a quorum. And my point, in a different piece you don't see here, is a query. Do you want to have this as 2/3 of the full board because it's an elevated issue? Everyone is known that subpoena power is an elevated issue. Do you want the full board to opine on this? Or are you willing to rely upon just having a quorum present at that meeting? Given technology we have right now, you can get a full vote, even electronically, if you need someone who's absent from a meeting. And so the question is, do you want them all to opine on this before you use this awesome power? You don't have to go with that. That was the recommendation or thought I shared with him. That's all.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Karantonis. Mr. Dorsey.
I was going to say quickly, and I'll do it again, but I think I did the math on this at some point because I was similarly thinking about the implications of this, and it's a difference of 4 or 5, whether or not 4 people consider the matter or 5. So, a quorum is 5, 2/3 of that quorum is 4, and 2/3 of 7 is 5. So,
Yeah, I think the protections, ultimately, I didn't want to be doing the math. I think that every COB member should be there, and they should make the decision, and I'm confident that facts end up driving what occurs, and I do think sunlight transparency are necessary are important in the process, even as I have regard for our department's work. I know that, so that's just, I tried to describe the amendment, and I don't know if there's discussion on the amendment. Sorry, go ahead, Mr. Dorsey.
thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to applaud you and Mr. Turner for working this through. I think it's, really an attempt to be responsive to a lot of what was heard, and I certainly don't have a quarrel with anything that's here, but I'm not sure it exactly helps deal with all of the issues that are surrounding this subpoena authority conversation, because in effect, it creates an additional layer into the system, which we can debate the merits of that and who would find that appealing or not. But ultimately, the presence and naming of the county manager implicitly invites that any issues with the manager's performance in the flow chart of decision-making here, if anyone has issue with it, there will be likely some sort of an appeal to the county board in some way, shape, or form, given that the county manager is responsive to us. And so I think, and I'll, depending, certainly let this conversation go to its rightful conclusion, but I think I'm inclined to offer what might be a streamlined approach that doesn't layer a level of bureaucracy and just sort of gets right to the issue. But I will wait for you to tell me when this conversation is suitably at a place where alternatives can be considered. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dorsey. I think now, from my perspective, now is the time so we understand it. And it would, I guess, essentially be, from my understanding, be a substitute for the language on A and B that was in the main motion that we earlier got out for discussion. So I am, if you are ready, I am ready to engage with your substitute, what will eventually, I believe, be a substitute motion, but I think it might help for us to see it and have you describe it.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Here goes. If hopefully Ms. Jacobs has the language, and I guess you would consider this option D now? What is this? I've lost count. So just to frame, if you were to remember the original option A and option B, this would be option B with a layer of review. So for those following at home, what was previously known as option B, this is where this picks up. I'm right on that, Ms. Kaur, right? Yeah.
Yes.
It's all getting confusing at this point. So it's option B, it is subpoena authority. One of the things that I've heard in this conversation and do believe generally, I associate myself with everyone, especially Mr. Turner, you said it so very well. The failure of this ordinance is if this becomes a tool that we have to rely on as a regular course of business, then we failed in this whole oversight model, and we need to do a whole lot of other things from the ground up to restore it, because that's not what works best. It's not what's intended. It's kind of like the whole idea of you hope to never have to use a sledgehammer, but when you do, it needs to be in good shape. So it's with that spirit that I am using B as a building block that has the authority, but is responsive to some of the things that have come up in public conversation along the way. One of the things that has been brought up is, well, is the authority going to be abused? Certainly, I don't associate myself with a belief that responsible citizens in Arlington County would, but is there a way that we can provide a level of protection and accountability for that? I think we can. So you can see the text here, and it applies the 2/3 vote standard that the chair has brought to this debate. And instead of the county manager as the previous version suggests, it's the county board who receives the application for authority to issue a subpoena. And if the board approves such a request, and again, the board would have to do so with a public action and a public hearing. So therefore, being accountable to the community, the oversight board could proceed under the mechanisms to go ahead and apply for a subpoena with the circuit court. So that's what it is.
Thank you, Mr. Dorsey. Ms. Crystal?
Under this model, what happens if the Arlington County Board denies? It ends. Okay.
Well, if they deny the ability for them to do it, then that's it. And let me just talk about this in reality, because I know if I may, I'm sorry, Mr. Chair.
Oh, yeah, sure. Go ahead, Mr. Dorsey. Thank you.
So if this is going to be rare, and we get to a place where the police department has denied access, and functionally speaking, that's with the county manager's complicity. If that has happened, there's something going on here, in which case I think it's a right avenue for the board to adjudicate what has become a very, very big deal. For the board to then say to the Civilian Oversight Board that it has constituted and appointed, we do not think that this is appropriate. While I know that that would be disappointing to the Civilian Oversight Board, the accountability to the public is maintained because whomever the 5 people or however many are on future boards, they will be accountable to everyone for that decision. That decision would have to be explained. It would have to be the basis for what you're willing to share with the community. And it's just one less step than, the other one. So that's why it's there. Anyway, yeah.
Thank you.
I won't say anything else about it.
Can I second the motion, however, if that's a motion?
Oh, we didn't do that. I'm so sorry.
So go ahead and make the motion is, go ahead and make the motion, if you would, Mr. Dorsey.
So thank you for the opportunity. I do move this language as a substitute to the main motion.
Second.
And seconded, Ms. Corder, we talked about the order in which this would occur. Essentially, this would be a Romanet 3 and replace, replace A and B, which are currently in our motion, which is the current Romanet 3. Okay, so
Yes.
we have go ahead.
Can I just clarify? So this is a motion to amend the main motion
That's correct.
to put this section 3 in place of option A and B. It's not a substitution motion.
Yes.
Good point. I was thinking about
Thank
this.
Yes, thank you for clarifying. I was thinking substituting the language, but it is a motion to amend the motion, the main motion, and Ms. Garvey has seconded it. And did you want to speak any further to your amendment? Mr. Dorsey.
Yes, so thank you all. I will keep this brief since through the questions I've already sort of explained the rationale from it. I get it. The board, it's not a comfortable place for the board to be involved in this stuff, but I will say again, my belief that if it ever got to the board, we've got a significant enough community issue that I don't think it's responsible to believe that the board could be expected to be out of it. If it escalates to this point, it's a frickin' big deal, and for the board to find some way procedurally or code-wise to be out of that conversation, to me, is irresponsible. And I say that I believe this option provides a clearer path of accountability at all levels, and also a speedier route for the COB to get responsiveness to a request that they feel is within their authority and scope and reasonableness.
Thank you, Mr. Dorsey. I see Ms. Garvey and then Mr. Carantonis.
Yeah, thank you. I'm pleased to support this. This feels like the way it ought to happen. Right now, the county board has the right to subpoena. We're elected. We take an oath of office. We're accountable to the voters. It's one of our jobs. As Mr. Dorsey points out, if it gets to that point, it's going to be a pretty uncomfortable situation. I actually feel it's unfair to put that on resident volunteers, as well-trained and as well-meaning as they might be. This is a tough, I've been in some of these tough places. It's really hard. I volunteered for this. I offered myself to the community, as we all did. And as I say, we're accountable to the community. So it feels like our responsibility. It doesn't feel right to me to put that responsibility on another group. That's just my view. I also will point out, I've looked at this, and it seems to me in all of these things, we keep talking about accountability. Police are accountable to their chief. The chief is accountable to the manager is accountable to the board is accountable to the public. The COB is accountable to no one. They're not hired. They're not elected. I don't believe they take an oath, and people may disagree, but that's the way I feel. I don't feel they have really any accountability. They will, talk to the community and things, but they're not out of a job. They don't have to go to the voters. So it feels to me not a correct place for this kind of authority to be. And again, I think that's one that we should take. I think it's going to be a tough situation if we're there, and that's the job of the board. And I think we ought to own that and keep that.
Thank you, Ms. Garvey. Mr. Karantonis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Dorsey, I sincerely appreciate the motivation and the thinking behind that. I have a couple of questions. Number one, mechanicals, plumbing issues. 2/3 to get the subpoena request to the county board, then another 2/3 to instruct the IPA to do if the board agrees. That's number one. Number two, the members of the oversight board are actually appointed by the county board.
And they can be removed.
And they can be removed. So that's a problem, right? When there's a difficult request is coming our way, or the way of this group here. So there is an issue of independence there, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's an issue with the legislation more so than anything else we're doing with this particular component of code. I mean, I understand exactly where you're coming from in terms of, true independence, in terms of there is absolutely no way for any entity to touch the COB. That doesn't exist by enabling legislation, is my understanding. I'll defer to the attorney on that. So given that is just the reality, it's how do you create as much independence as you possibly can. Harken back to what Ms. Garvey said, this is an authority, the subpoena authority is what the board, this county board, is currently vested in, and this is an act of delegating it. So to me, this is more about dictating, or not dictating, but structuring the terms of how that delegation is to occur. And I will just say to your original question, I am very open in the spirit of collaboration. If people think that the 2/3 in both instances is redundant or unnecessary, that's not anything that's an essential component of this recommendation. It was just trying to carry through some of the good work that the chair had instituted previously.
Thank you, Mr. Karantonis. So the question will certainly come back, and Mr. Dorsey for sharing your thoughts on the question. Ms. Crystal.
Thank you, Mr. Dorsey, for advancing this. I have been desperate over the past couple of days to envision an option that would square the circle. And so I completely understand the instinct to do it. I can't support this because to me, this doesn't resolve the question of, does the oversight board have subpoena power, do they not? This civilian oversight board or community oversight board in this circumstance doesn't have subpoena authority. They don't have that power. It is subordinate to the decision of the county board. I am actually not sure that if that ability or authority is going to be subordinate to someone, that it's better that it go to the county board than the county manager. I've thought a lot about the NACOL recommendations and how NACOL defines independence. And importantly, they talk about the independence of the Community Oversight Board, or CRBs or COBs, not only from law enforcement, but from political actors. And, everything has an upside and a downside in public life, I've realized. And the downside of the accountability that the board has in the nature of our electedness, the downside of that is, or the flip side of that is, politics is political. We are a political body. And for reasons that I'm happy to enumerate in my closing comments, I have come down on this side of believing that the COB should have subpoena authority. I think not only does this proposal deny them that, but it actually denies them that in favor of a political actor rather than the culmination of the ACPD chain of command, which is the county manager. So with deep respect to you for offering it, I cannot support this one either.
Thank you, Ms. Crystal. For my part on this amendment, I think it is a consequence that is so great that I don't think it would be used. And give an example, one option, and I'll take a risk, but one option, someone asked me is open the schools now or withhold all their funding. That's not a consequence that I'm going to do. And so that's a risk of an issue to even mention. I'm hoping not too many are listening, but we'll go forward with it. And I'll just say that I feel that we need this part of giving this oversight board a robustness, in my view, is A and B and not to the county board. I will note, I want to be very careful to be respectful. I guess it's a question maybe for Mr. Turner, the county attorney. It's still in this ordinance that the oversight board is appointed by us and can be removed by us, right?
Yes.
Okay. That also would have challenges. So are there any other questions or comments or discussion of the amendment? I'll go to Ms. Garvey and then Mr. Dorsey.
Yeah, and I'll just point out, because they're appointed by the county board, it's political. Doesn't matter whether they've got the subpoena, they come to us or not. These are political situations. There's no getting away from politics. We all live together. That's how we choose to, that's how human beings interact and decide and make decisions. It's political. There's no getting away from it. And again, I feel that we've got that responsibility. We've got it now, and to give it to residents, I don't think is proper. I don't think is fair to them, and I don't think it will be helpful, but I will stop talking now, and I would like to be able to vote on this motion when we're ready.
Thank you, Ms. Garvey. Mr. Dorsey.
Thank you, and I'll get to us very quickly. Just to put another fine point on it, the questioning elicited by Mr. Karantonis, option B, which is what this is based on, that subpoena authority that's in there is subordinate to the county board deciding to allow the COB members to exist. So I'm just being transparent. That's all I'm saying here. And I'll leave it at that.
So thank you, Mr. Dorsey. We're close to actually taking a vote. I know everyone's ready. Mr. Karantonis.
Oh, just the remark that, yes, indeed, the members, the body itself is nominated and empowered by the county board, but this dependency doesn't go down to the individual case. So for now, at least, in this case, it would be down to the individual case. And as Ms. Crystal mentioned, there is a dead end there. The subpoena power is not complete. So, and I cannot support that with.
Thank you.
Standing for the motives.
Thank you, Mr. Karantonis. Vestigial hand or new hand, Ms. Crystal?
Vestigial.
Okay, so the question is on Mr. Dorsey's amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, nay.
Nay.
Nay. The amendment fails 3-2. Now we've discussed the subpoena. We can open the floor to any other additional questions or comments on the subpoena. I also believe that we are close. I do want to thank Mr. Dorsey for offering the amendment in the spirit of doing so. And so are there concluding comments, questions about, I know we will each want to speak to the broader issues of building faith with our communities that historically have not perhaps been best served, or have not been best served, excuse me. And also officer wellness. So we'll take comments as we have them. I will, we also can have questions if there are any that folks have to resolve. I guess I will see if there's a way that I can ask Chief Penn if there are any thoughts that you wanted to add. I'll also be asking Mr. Turner as well a separate question with respect to if you have any thoughts on, frankly, the broader issues that Mr. Smith raised with respect to whether you wrestled with perception as we seek to build faith with our communities of color, which have been, that will be a question I'll want to ask you, but I also want to ask Mr. Chief Penn regarding officer wellness, and I'll just state more for the record that yesterday we honored officers who protected the Capitol, and I know it might not be easy for all, but I see that honoring as consistent with the transparency and accountability that I think our officers have expressed a support for. And so did you have thoughts that you wanted to add on officer wellness, Chief Penn?
Sure. Generally, as you've seen, our employee groups are here and supportive of oversight. I'm 100% supportive of transparency and accountability. I think the goal is to find the structure that takes into account the history of ACPD. I mean, I believe that we are a very professional agency, and I'm incredibly proud to lead this agency and proud of the staff that work here. And I assure you that I understand and believe that law enforcement must be held to a higher standard, and I am committed to doing just that. I do have concerns about well-being, going through an administrative investigation. I've been in internal affairs a couple of times, and it can be very taxing on people to go through, particularly a prolonged, but something that's very sensitive or job-threatening or potentially life-changing. It is a lot for officers to go through. And it's important to me that we take good care of our officers as they, we have to do our job and we will do our job, but it's important to me that we take good care of them to make sure that they're in a good place to go home and a good place to continue serving the community. And that's just incredibly important to me.
Thank you, Chief Penn. Mr. Turner, we heard from our public, and I want to be clear that we also are very mindful of the importance of building trust, even in Arlington. But is there comments or thoughts that you have with respect to Mr. Smith's thoughts on perception and reality, and the importance of building faith and seeking to start increasing or increasing, maybe I should just say, of trust? Do you have any thoughts in that regard?
So speaking for myself, not as a PPG member, no, I take those comments to heart. I can appreciate the concern about the perception of not being trusted. And I think I've expressed this to you, the subpoena power, as I said before, can be awesome if it's ever deployed. But I think this whole effort about trying to create civilian oversight also has an element of concern about trust. And so I'm not certain that the subpoena power being one small part of it is going to tip the scale on the wellness issue. I understand they feel like they're under the gun to a certain degree. I appreciate that. And they are in a profession that's, being scrutinized right now. I want to, first of all, once again say, members of the PPG, we appreciate the work that ACPD has done. We appreciate their efforts to participate in this process. But I think they also acknowledge that there are concerns in the community. And so to sort of put a fine point on the question about the wellness issue, concerned about it. I don't know if the subpoena power is going to tip the scales on that. I think the whole issue about being scrutinized is the wellness issue. So I personally, I don't think that the granting subpoena power is going to then make everyone run for the hills, but that's just my perspective.
Thank you, Mr. Turner. Appreciate it. I think now ready for concluding comments. I will say one One item is that I will bring one thing into the room, which is my view that collective bargaining is important, and funding the salaries of our officers is also important. And so we will have, in next year's budget, we will have a moment where I will certainly will be supporting increases, and I am mindful that the manager, that we have to address budget, be fiscally responsible. But with that, I'll start with concluding comments, and then if colleagues want to gather your thoughts. Ultimately, as we listened to the comments and we heard, I don't know the precise number, whether it was 120 or 100 plus, certainly in letters from the NAACP, there was a weight to that made an impression on me. This Civilian Oversight Board needs to include, as Ms. Abrams said, real community oversight. I don't agree with everything that Mr. Rogers said, but oversight and accountability I believe in. Mr. Weir had thoughtful remarks, and many of our others had thoughtful remarks. I respectfully disagree with Ms. Thomas, ultimately that we need more time, because I'm eager to start doing this, to ask for legislative changes and to start working on this. I'm mindful that the ordinance is probably not perfect. Mr. Meehan, heard your thoughts. Ms. Munson as well. Ms. Dewitt, I respect your views. I'm not sure. I actually hope that the discussion tonight may have provided some hope for you. Constitutional concerns, Mr. Farr, I respect. Mr. Henninger, I oppose the death penalty, and I hear you on and respect deeply remember in November. I think you mean that both for this November and next November, and I agree with both those and respect that. Ms. Clement, I respect views. Ms. Kelly, thank you for all the work. Ms. McIntyre, your description of the right turn on red stuck with me. Mr. Smith, I should have known that in Arlington we had someone who, everyone has, thank you for your perspective and 10 years prosecuting and very thoughtful remarks. Mr. Bates, your comments on mental health of officers stuck with me, I believe, when we had a conversation over the last week, and certainly stuck with me tonight. I hope that you can hear that thought. Mr. Yonda, I've already mentioned that your comments made an impression. Ms. Perry, I think the manager has addressed that. We will have get that legislation passed to have county board oversight of the independent officer. Ms. Verasing, partnership I agree with. Ms. Woolley, I think the thought of sunlight has come through. Mr. Spain, I believe ultimately we have met the test of your comments, but I know you will be the judge of that. And I think I've covered Mr. Bennett. I really appreciate your professionalism, and ultimately I come down on supporting the ordinance as a whole. Sorry to be tedious. I want you to know that we are learning, we are listening, and certainly trust is a big issue, as Ms. James mentioned, and ultimately I respect Mr. Conigliero's thoughts, but come down on a very tough call, feeling that we need to take this step to build trust. So thank you, colleagues. Mr. Dorsey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to everyone who's come out tonight to speak virtually in person. Really special thanks to Mr. Turner for representing the PPG and your colleagues, Saul Reyes, Captain Chamberlain, Kent Carter, and Kim Phillip. You all, I just can't say it again, doing the job that you were tasked to do, and then accepting willingly homework, and then doing an A+ effort on that homework, and even highlighting for us areas where we were still, not exactly looking at things as they needed to. Just a really tremendous job, and I think it's fair to say, or at least how I view it at this point, outside of the disciplinary authority conversation, which we have talked about, the recommendations that we are about to vote on reflect not only your recommendations, but your continued engagement in shaping those recommendations to this finished product. So thank you. A lot's been said, so I'll just try to really be brief. Wherever we are with the ordinance, I know has generated a lot of attention. I would be remiss if we didn't leave tonight understanding that from here, we have significant work to do standing up an organization that's going to deliver on the promise of all of the ideals that we've talked about. And that involves a lot of, nuts and bolts work that people are probably not going to follow along with, and I understand that. But if we go back to the enabling legislation, the legislature did the most responsible thing, providing broad authority for us to engage in review, oversight, investigation, discipline, according to our local needs and determinations and process. I think the way we're proceeding right now makes sense given the limitations in the statute in terms of hiring that we've talked about, but also because when you think about organizational development, very few people go ahead and go from 0 to 100 right away. They, maybe start by getting their code and bylaws right. They start to equip with personnel. They see what they need. They see what needs to be changed, and they structure it so that they do it well. I think we do have an opportunity to do that here, and I think that this is something that I hope people will be engaged with over the next 18 months, 2 years especially, so that we can hopefully get it right and then come back and bring for the public a review of how the ordinance may or may not need to be changed. I'll just sort of end with this. I love that perception versus reality framing. It got me thinking a lot. And, perception is reality and reality is reality. Trustworthy people can be viewed, cannot be trusted by others. I think Dr. Fauci would probably have something to say about that. And, the point is, he's not going to be very successful if he just continues to tell people that he is a voice to be trusted if they don't trust him, even though he is, in fact, trustworthy. It's only going to be through time and his actions, which are either seen or interpreted in a new light, which are going to cause that trust equation to change. That's really what we have to set in place here. An opportunity for the community to figure out if our police department is to be trusted, if they don't believe so already, and vice versa, for the police department to trust that the oversight that is being instituted today is designed not to get them, but to improve our overall approach to policing. There's no way we could have structured this ordinance today to effectuate that result. Wasn't going to happen. Let's be real. It's going to take some time. I pray, actually, what we have set in place allows that to occur somewhat organically with more than deliberate speed. That was the intent and the hope. If we get there, it's great. If we haven't, we're going to have to take a look at this again in the very near future. I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Mr. Dorsey. Mr. Karantonis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I recognize that we came a long way here, and Mr. Turner, I cannot thank enough you and your team and the PVG for all the work you have done. Even if this ordinance doesn't reflect the 100% of your recommendations, you gave a lot of us to think about. I also want to thank all the advocates. And it's not only one or two organizations that were here and testified. This is we received really broad input on this. And I have to say, and at no point, and I'm very honest about that, to our women and men in uniform, at no point anybody was testifying against the Arlington police. They were rather testifying for their communities to be heard. It was the digestion of the summer of 2020, the understanding that we as a community, to be successful, we have to rely not only to our progressiveness or to our good spirit or democratic and liberal disposition or, persuasion, but also to institutions. And that we have to create these institutions, and they have to be sturdy, and they have to be whole, and they have to get to results when and if the case demands that. Remember that we really are instituting that because we think for the very rare circumstances or the possible circumstance of having misconduct and having to deal with that. And this is really important, to have institutions that will deal with that in an accountable, fair, fact-finding way. And independence of these institutions is critical here, to the degree we can achieve that. And impartiality is important. I heard Mr. Yonda, he used a verb. He has the oversight board will monitor us, the police department. No, actually, it's not. It's going to be receiving complaints if they occur, and I hope they won't, frankly. Chief, I remember the first conversation we had, the very first, when I joined this board. You were so kind to give me a lot of your time, and you explained to me with absolutely deep detail what it means, what the wellness issue means. You gave me some numbers that I really remember them very, very well, because, like you, it wouldn't let me sleep at night sometimes. So this is something I take very, very seriously, but I really don't think, I think that there are many, many factors that contribute to that, and we have to take them very seriously, as we have to take the issue of wellness very seriously. It is wrong to misinterpret that effort here that we don't trust our police department. All the contrary, we trust our police department, period. And we trust our community. And we are creating an institution that's a bridge of trust that creates the conditions where if we have an issue of misconduct, we won't let it unresolved. It will be resolved. Any allegation, it will be clear slate. And I believe that this provides, this actually helps both the community and our police force. So that said, NACO, they did a recent survey. So out of 64 respondents, 38, it was in the Washington Post, I believe, 38 communities with a oversight body, 38 had no independent investigative authority. We do have independent investigative authority. 30 couldn't issue subpoenas. I very much hope that we will be able to issue subpoenas, period, end of story. 34, they cannot recommend even disciplinary action. I do think that we have a good way to have disciplinary action recommendations. Now, is that a very, or the strongest, from the point of view of advocates, civilian review board? I don't know. I don't believe myself. I would like to have something that goes to the full extent of what the enabling legislation would give us. But we are a community of balance, and we have to go with the balance that we can find in this community. There is a lot of work left to do. There is an MOU to be done. There is an IPA to be hired. There is a board, the first board to be nominated and start to create this institution. So I'm extremely focused on these first, on this creation period of this board. I do believe that we will going to, like we learned in these 2 months, and I wish we had more, like we learned this so much in these 2 months, I am absolutely certain that we will learn a lot more as we go, and we actually create the institution. And I invite our community and our police department to lean in this process, to see how it works, to identify the issues, propose solutions. And I am sure that my colleagues will be, really engaged in this. This is not a battlefield. This is really a place where we come together as a community, create an institution, and can be proud of our local democracy, actually. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Karantonis. Ms. Garvey.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you, everybody, for being here. We're getting late. We live in a wonderful community, and we're really lucky to live here. Sometimes I think we forget that. And it's not by accident. There's a lot of hard work that goes in. We've got incredible employees. We've got incredible residents. But we could lose it, and we need to make sure we don't do that. I have been watching all of this discussion. I think we're at a really important point in the country, actually in the world. We're in very turbulent times. And as we get through these turbulent times, we've got to hold on to what's right and what's good. And we're trying really hard as a community to do that. I was pleased to hear the folks, the advocates, a couple of them saying that they respected the police. That's good. And Mr. Karantonis said that this is not against the police. But I've heard other language that's been really over the top, and actually I think not true at times, and I understand people get really passionate, but it's not helpful. It's not helpful, and it doesn't build trust. So from now on, we are at a really important point. We've got to all come together, and we've got to work hard to make this work. Everybody in this room is a leader in some ways. Some of them have emergencies that call us to keep this community safe. We are all leaders, and we have a responsibility. We have to treat this community as the actually fairly vulnerable thing it is. We've got to come together. We've got to work together. So we need to watch our language. And moving forward, I hope everybody's careful about how they represent things and how they talk about it. We're at an important point here. We're at a good point. Language is important. This particular ordinance is not exactly what I would want. I am going to support it. A lot of good work has gone into it, and I'm going to work really hard to make it work. Accountability, as I say, is important, and we got to make sure everybody's accountable, absolutely everybody. Nobody gets away without being accountable. And that includes when you use your language. Please, everybody needs to hold each other accountable for how we talk about each other and how we talk about the county. That includes me. People can hold me accountable as well. Please do. So I'm looking forward, in about a year after this gets formed, I think, Mr. Chair, next June, as Mr. Dorsey pointed out, might be a little early. But I think we do really need to come back, not in 2 years. I would like to come back in a year after this group has been formed, and really we've had a chance to try things. And we're going to start to realize what some really significant costs are. And how we're going to deal with that, because this group has got very significant powers and responsibilities, and they need to be able to have the kind of support and that they need to handle those responsibilities, and that's going to take money. And we need to make sure that we're comfortable with what we need to give this board to support their work. And make sure that their work is exactly what we are needing. I think it will help us get to a better place. I look forward, hopefully, to more trust. I look forward, again, to all of us working together and all of us being responsible with each other. Again, I can't emphasize enough how important it is, people in this room. This community depends on us working together. So we need to watch our language. We need to watch how we treat each other. And we need to work together, and I am looking forward to doing that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Garvey. Before Ms. Crystal, I'll just clarify, we didn't change June 2023 to June 2022. I think Mr. Dorsey captured it correctly. You said it, Ms. Garvey. I think, Mr. Manager, we're all comfortable that we're seeking legislative changes, and we will come back if we have them. And it may be a little later than June of next year, but if we get legislative changes, we'll need to revisit this. Is that a fair direction from the board? I'm seeing head nods from colleagues. I think that's where we are with that. Ms. Crystal, go ahead.
Thank you. Well, thank you for the opportunity to share some concluding comments. I want to begin first with the issue of subpoena power, one I have wrestled with, and I was, until a few days ago, wrestling with it because it seemed like such a small thing to divide this community over. It felt to me like it was a situation where we were sort of on the same path until we reached a vanishingly unlikely circumstance where the independent policing auditor and the COB disagreed with OPR and the chief and the manager, and then the paths could diverge into option A or option B. The recognition that I at last had was that actually the subpoena power is integral to the independence of the Community Oversight Board and of the independent auditor monitor. Because otherwise, the COB is just another step in the ACPD chain of command. And civilian steps in the chain of command, the manager, are incredibly important, and we have them. And if the COB is not empowered to follow through, if they disagree with how the work of investigation should be conducted, then ultimately they are advisory. They are not independent. And the community will know it. We could create a community oversight board that would be staffed with thoughtful leaders. We could invest in their training and support them with significant general fund resources to hire an independent auditor monitor and access legal counsel. And all of those resources would basically be expensive additional levels to the existing chain of command. That might be worth doing, but it doesn't contribute to the overall goal of increasing trust and transparency in the police department. With it, I think our COB and our IPA can be truly independent. It means that our COB can fulfill NACOL's first principle of effective oversight organizations, which is as follows. The most important and defining concept of civilian oversight of law enforcement is independence. In order to maintain legitimacy, an agency must be able to demonstrate the extent and impact of its independence from law enforcement, especially in the face of high-profile issues. I want to say that I know zero tolerance for misconduct is the bedrock of a trustworthy police department in general, and zero tolerance for misconduct is the bedrock of this trustworthy police department. The power and the promise of the COB, as I see it, is that an independent group of trained residents, led and guided by a professional and experienced investigator, will validate that. And I know that some of our officers see a vote to endow the COB with subpoena power as evidence of a lack of trust. I am voting for it because of my trust in this department. And so we have before us, I think, a powerful and independent COB that we are about to empower through this ordinance with guardrails on how they exercise that power. Not weakening of their power, guardrails on how they exercise it. The speed bumps on the exercise of subpoena power that Mr. Turner described so well, they will create the significantly greater incentives to collaborate. Collaborating will be the easier path, exactly as we want it to be. Empowering the IPA for the concurrent interview or investigatory processes means that interviews will be conducted by a professional with skill in protecting the integrity of investigations and with skill in preventing the mental health of those being interviewed and involved in the process. And the last thing I want to say about the COB and the version of the ordinance we've got before us, and then a few more concluding comments, but no one should mistake our officers' expressions of stress or worry about a new or unknown system of accountability for rejection of accountability. There is an archetype of the police department that rejects accountability, resists transparency because they want to close rank around bad cops. That might be a national narrative, and it is deeply at odds with ACPD. And it is an unfair characterization of a department, a chief, a leadership team, and dozens of individual officers who have embraced the idea of a community oversight board and who have a track record themselves of coming forward to report misconduct. I want to say thank you to the PPG subcommittee, especially Mr. Reyes, Mr. Carter, Ms. Phillip, Captain Chamberlain, Mr. Turner, Chairman Turner. I will admit that I have felt some anxiety over whether we are going to find people willing to take on the training and the reputational stakes and the intellectually and emotionally difficult work of serving on the COB, but your example gives me hope that those people are in our community and they will step forward. I want to thank as well in addition to those who were here tonight, but those who came to speak at our listening and conversation session, which I found to be an incredibly meaningful exercise, unlike any I think we've done as a board, certainly in my time. I hope that you've seen your fingerprints here on this ordinance, or at least in our deliberations and the comments you shared with us. Here's my last point, not about the Civilian Oversight Board at all. There are systematic racial inequalities in criminal justice in Arlington. Many of them originate at the point of arrest or traffic stops, as speakers have compellingly described tonight with both statistics and their personal stories. And I believe that there are practices and policies, or a lack of practices and policies, within ACPD that contribute to this. Because this is true in every department of county government, as our chief equity officer so compellingly detailed for us just last night. And I know, because the PPG studied this and gave us excellent recommendations, that there are also other departments that need to be involved in this work of addressing the disparities in racial disparities in criminal justice in Arlington, from our transportation department to our behavioral health division. Right now, because this community and this board has been so consumed with these potential individual instances of misconduct, we are not doing the work to address the systemic issues. Or actually, the police department are the only ones doing this work, because I think they're prepared to have these conversations. They're committed to having these conversations, but they need our voices, all of us, the board, the community who came out, the lived experiences of people of color shared, to do that. I think this is the real work of improving criminal justice and creating a more fair and equitable system of public safety in Arlington. I think we have let that slide in the pursuit of the creation of a COB, and I hope that with this ordinance's passage, we can refocus ourselves on that most important work. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Crystal. On the last note, I do want to do it. I don't want to do that tonight. I would like to vote on this ordinance tonight. But thanks to each of you colleagues for your comments. I will say, to return, we have equity and civility that we seek to continue to emphasize as themes. And with that, I will call for a vote. Is there any other?
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
I'm sorry. It's been 2 hours since the main motion was called. Could you please just recap what the motion is?
Sure, happy to. So the motion is, Ms. Jacobs, it is essentially what we have shown with multiple changes, changing the word review to oversight. It is broadly creating recommending disciplinary actions. We talked about findings, but we did not include that. It is what was shown on Ms. Jacobs on the overhead, as described, with option A and B as what we were doing. So, to my recollection, I was thinking through, it is the motion as originally offered without any amendments.
Right. I just want to clarify that the document shown by Ms. Jacobs is not the document that is shown on the website. So I believe your motion is to move to adopt that document, taking option A and B. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. Thank you, Ms. Kaur, for doing that. I appreciate it. So the motion is options A and B, and the ordinance as shown on Ms. Jacobs' overhead. Does that qualify? Great.
Yes.
And I see a couple of vestigial microphones, I hope. So the question, thank you, Ms. Kaur, for clarifying. The question is on the motion. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes 5-0. With that, thank you to our public and those who watched, and to our officers, all of our public, and all who wrote in on this issue. You are welcome to stay, but I will ask Ms. Jacobs, are there any other items to come before the board tonight?
No, they're not.
With that, we are adjourned.
Still September.